Accident on the Ice, from the Scots Magazine and Edinburgh Literary Miscellany, Volume 78, from January 1816. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The following melancholy account happened on the ice at Loch End near Edinburgh on the 18th of December. A young lad, son of Mr. Patrick Hadaway of Leith, having ventured on the ice when too weak to bear, unfortunately lost his life, and was the unhappy cause of involving a most deserving young man, Lieutenant Crawley of the Royal Navy, who generously attempted to save him, in the same fate. Lieutenant Crawley was the only son of Captain Crawley of the Royal Navy, Gayfield Square, and had newly returned to his friends along with his father from foreign service. He was a most zealous and enterprising officer, and was much endeared both to his relations and acquaintances by the most pleasing manners, and by a temper singularly engaging and affectionate. He was in his 22nd year. The following account of his character is given by his friends. The service in which he has been bred for 10 years knows his worth as an officer, as a man. He was humane and sincere, innocent and unassuming in his manners. He obtained the good opinion of all who knew him. He was a comfort to his parents, to whom he ever showed the most dutiful and loving obedience, from his infancy to his death. They never saw him in a passion. The meekness and simplicity of his whole life was very remarkable, and was immediately noticed by those who were almost perfect strangers to his character and disposition. Another gentleman, Lieutenant Hutcheson, had also nearly perished. He had advanced with his friend Lieutenant Crawley to throw a rope to the boy, who was struggling to keep himself above water when the ice broke. A person appeared at this time with a life-preserver bound round him, which, however, not thinking it safe to use, he unbuckled it and threw it from him. Lieutenant Hutcheson, now seeing his friend Lieutenant Crawley struggling hard, went in to his assistance, but soon found himself in the same perilous situation, and the machine, it is stated, proved of no use to him. He endeavoured in vain to gain the shore, the broken ice, which was both hard and thick, preventing him from using his arms, which were much bruised and cut. After struggling in this situation for about half an hour, a rope was thrown to him, which he with great difficulty laid hold of, and by the exertions of a young gentleman of the name of Douglas, he was enabled to reach the shore. The frost was succeeded by a sudden and powerful thaw, which, although not attended by such fatal consequences, caused very considerable damage in these places where the snow had accumulated in great depth. Glasgow, December 30. The thaw, which commenced on Thursday, has continued. During yesterday and last night there was a very heavy fall of rain, accompanied by a strong westerly wind. The Clyde has risen to a great height. The Low Green, Bridgegate, and other places on the north bank of the river are covered, several feet deep, with water. It is one wide expanse of water from the buildings at Brummelaw, where, on the pavement, the water is 18 inches deep, to Clyde buildings on the south side of the river. And at 9 o'clock this morning a skiff was employed as a ferry boat. People are taken by horse and cart to the top of the new bridge from Jamaica Street, and to the old bridge from Stockwell Street, but a land passage to the former is got by Maxwell and Clyde Streets. The flood began to abate this morning about 7 o'clock. It fell about 5 inches, but appears to be again rising. At its greatest height at midnight, it was 36 1/4 inches lower than the flood on the 12th of March, 1782, and 3 feet and 6 1/2 inches lower than the floor of the public offices. The timber bridge remains entire, although the current runs with uncommon velocity. Several vessels are floating on top of the quay at the Brummelaw, and yesterday 2 steamboats were forced from their anchorage and impelled down the stream. It is, however, expected that before the flood subsides, the stranded vessels will be got off. The consternation and alarm which this flood has occasioned to the poor people who chiefly inhabit the lower part of the town are very great, and many of their houses will be rendered uninhabitable for a considerable time. We believe that a subscription will be set on foot for their relief. The Edinburgh mail, which arrives between 5 and 6 o'clock, did not reach Glasgow till 10 o'clock this forenoon. The storminess of the night retarded its progress. The coach had only got to the 7th milestone, near the almond water, when the horses were unable to proceed, from water overflowing the road, and carrying along with it vast sheets of ice. The guard and driver took the horses from the coach and with great difficulty reached a neighbouring house, where they obtained assistance and fresh horses. The passengers, 5 in number, were taken from the coach on horseback. At 1 o'clock they proceeded on their journey, leaving the coach, as they were unable, from the depth of the water, to remove it. In the darkness of the night, and amid the general dismay, the flood carried off one of the coach horses. At Linlithgow, a horse for the bags and a chaise for the passengers were obtained. January 2nd. The flood in the river is over, but we are sorry to find that much mischief has been done to the poor persons who inhabit the low part of the town. All the vessels stranded have been got off, with the exception of a steamboat lying on the bank at the west end of the new quay, Brummelaw. The 2 steamboats, noticed last as having drifted from their places, have been secured at Renfrew. Scarcely one of the lamp-posts lately erected on the breastwork is now standing. Although made of iron and mounted on a block of stone, they have been wrenched from their bases, to which they were fixed by bolts and lead. 3 of the bridges at Hamilton have been forced from their places: the Ross, stone; the Farm, timber; and Millhew, stone. The timber bridge, after floating about 4 miles, landed on the racecourse of Hamilton. The bridge at Nuneaton has also been destroyed, a circumstance that will greatly retard the progress of the London mail. Nearly 80 of sheep were carried off from the grounds near Bothwell Bridge. The Kelvin, having also risen to a great height, has done considerable damage to the public works and its banks. The Clyde had rendered the road from Glasgow to Hamilton impassable, and the London coach on Saturday proceeded by Rutherglen. Carlisle, December 30th. Towards the conclusion of the week, a considerable quantity of rain fell, so that yesterday evening the Caldew overflowed its banks, covering the home lands, and flooding many parts of Caldewgate. The water is rapidly increasing, and it is believed that the River Eden will also occasion a deluge. This latter river, from the greater distance of its source, and running more upon a level, rises more gradually than the Caldew. Caldewgate is flooded in several parts 3 feet, and as far up as the diverging road to Wigton, Burgh, etc. The inhabitants busily employed in damming up their doors to prevent the intrusion of the watery visitant. We are sorry to add that a drowned horse, saddled and bridled, has come down the Caldew, and there is too much reason to fear that its rider has been overwhelmed by the impetuous torrent. Whitehaven, January 2nd. The weather lately has been the most severe and changeable ever remembered in the course of at least 40 years. All the former landstorms within that period, however bitter they might have been, were not subjected to such vicissitudes of snow, rain, and frost which have, for more than a fortnight, been continually succeeding each other, with an interval of change very frequently of only a few minutes. The streets of this town have been repeatedly rendered impassable from the heavy rain which had fallen in the course of a day, and in such abundance as to give an idea of complete thaw. But in a very short time the pavements exhibited so many entire sheets of ice. Snow, which had disappeared in the evening, was again visible the next morning. It melted, a deluge of rain fell, and at the close of the day it was followed by an intense frost, which in its turn yielded to the influence of an atmosphere the most variable within the recollection of any person living. End of Accident on the Ice, from the Scots Magazine, 1816. Read by Alister.
AgePage, Forgetfulness, Knowing When to Ask for Help, by National Institute on Aging, National Institutes of Health. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Maria has been a teacher for 35 years. Recently, she has begun to forget details and has become more and more disorganized. At first, she laughed it off, but her memory problems have worsened. Her family and friends have been sympathetic but are not sure what to do. Parents and colleagues are worried about Maria's performance in the classroom. The principal suggested she see a doctor. Maria wonders if these problems are signs of Alzheimer's disease or just forgetfulness that comes with getting older. Many people worry about becoming forgetful. They think forgetfulness is the first sign of Alzheimer's disease. Scientists have learned a lot about memory and why some kinds of memory problems are serious while others are not. Age-related memory changes. Forgetfulness can be a normal part of aging. As people get older, changes occur in all parts of the body, including the brain. As a result, some people may notice that it takes longer to learn new things. They don't remember information as well as they did, or they misplace things such as their eyeglasses. These usually are signs of mild forgetfulness rather than serious memory problems. Some older adults also find that they don't do as well as younger people on complex memory or learning tests. Yet, scientists have found that healthy older adults often do just as well as younger adults on these tests when given enough time to complete them. In fact, as they age, healthy adults usually improve in areas of mental ability such as vocabulary. Other causes of memory loss. Some memory problems are related to health issues that may be treatable. For example, medication side effects, vitamin B12 deficiency, chronic alcoholism, and tumors, infections, or blood clots in the brain can cause memory loss or possibly dementia. Some thyroid, kidney, or liver disorders also can lead to memory loss. A doctor should treat these and other types of serious medical conditions as soon as possible. Emotional problems, such as stress, anxiety, or depression, can make a person more forgetful and can be mistaken for dementia. For example, someone who has recently retired or who is coping with the death of a spouse, relative, or friend may feel sad, lonely, worried, or bored. Trying to deal with these life changes leaves some people confused or forgetful. Confusion and forgetfulness caused by emotions usually are temporary and go away as the feelings fade. If you struggle with ongoing feelings of forgetfulness or confusion while grieving, it is important to get help from a doctor or counselor. Treatment may require counseling, medication, or both. More serious memory problems. For some older adults, memory problems can be a sign of mild cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease or a related dementia. If you are worried about memory problems, see your primary care provider. Your provider may refer you to a neurologist, a physician who specializes in problems related to the brain and central nervous system. Your provider will review your medical and family history and any prescription or over-the-counter medicines you take. You may also need to do a physical exam and neurological tests to assess memory, balance, language, and other cognitive functions. Blood tests, urine tests, and brain scans can also help find or rule out possible causes of the memory problems. In addition to talking with you, your provider might ask a family member, caregiver, or close friend for information. Mild cognitive impairment. Some people with memory problems have a condition called mild cognitive impairment, MCI. People with this condition have more cognitive problems, the ability to clearly think, learn, and remember, than normal for people their age. Their symptoms are not as severe as those of people with Alzheimer's disease, and people with MCI are able to carry out their normal daily activities. Signs of MCI include losing things often, forgetting to go to important events or appointments, having more trouble coming up with words than other people of the same age. Family and friends may notice memory lapses, and the person with MCI may worry about losing his or her memory. These worries may prompt the person to see a doctor for diagnosis. There is no standard treatment or approved medication for MCI, but there may be habits and behaviors you can change and activities you can do to help maintain your memory and thinking skills. If you have MCI, visit your healthcare provider every 6 to 12 months to track changes in memory and other thinking skills over time. MCI may be an early sign of Alzheimer's disease, but not everyone with MCI develop Alzheimer's. Dementia. Dementia is the loss of thinking, memory, reasoning skills, and behavioral abilities to such an extent that these symptoms interfere with a person's daily life and activities. Dementia is not a disease itself, but a group of symptoms caused by certain diseases or conditions such as Alzheimer's disease. Dementia is not a normal part of aging. Symptoms of dementia may include being unable to remember things, asking the same questions or repeating the same story over and over, becoming lost in familiar places, having trouble following directions, getting confused about time, people, and places, having trouble handling money and paying bills, experiencing increased anxiety and/or aggression. Two of the most common causes of dementia in older adults are Alzheimer's disease and vascular dementia. There are currently no medicines that can stop the progression of these conditions or prevent someone from getting them. In Alzheimer's disease, changes in certain parts of the brain result in the death of many nerve cells. Symptoms of Alzheimer's begin slowly and worsen steadily as damage to nerve cells spreads throughout the brain. As time goes by, forgetfulness gives way to serious problems with memory, judgment, recognizing family and friends, and the ability to perform daily activities. Eventually, the person needs full-time care. In vascular dementia, injuries to the vessels supplying blood to the brain lead to the death of brain tissue, often after a stroke or series of strokes. Symptoms of vascular dementia can vary but usually begin suddenly, depending on the location and severity of a stroke. The person's memory, language, reasoning, and coordination may be affected. Mood and personality changes are common as well. Some people have both Alzheimer's and vascular dementia, a condition known as mixed dementia. Other types of dementia include Lewy body dementia and frontotemporal disorders. More information can be found at www.nih.gov/what-dementia-symptoms-types-and-diagnosis. Treatment for dementia. A person with dementia should be under a doctor's care. The doctor might be a primary care physician, neurologist, internist, geriatrician, or psychiatrist. The doctor can help treat the patient's physical and behavioral problems, such as agitation or wandering, and answer any questions that the person or family may have. There currently are several medications approved by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration that may, for some people, help slow down certain dementia symptoms, such as memory loss and behavioral problems. They may enable the person to remain independent for longer. However, none of these drugs can prevent or stop the progression of Alzheimer's disease or a related dementia. Be aware of unproven treatments, such as those labeled as dietary supplements that promise to improve memory or prevent dementia. Talk with your doctor before you take any new product. Researchers are investigating medications and other interventions to prevent or delay Alzheimer's disease and related dementias. People with vascular dementia should take steps to prevent further strokes. These include controlling high blood pressure, monitoring and treating high cholesterol and diabetes, not smoking. Family members and friends can help people in the early stages of dementia continue their daily routines, physical activities, and social contacts. People with dementia should be kept up to date about the details of their lives, the time of day, where they live, and what is happening at home and beyond. Memory aids, such as a calendar, a list of daily plans, or setting reminders on a smartphone or other device may help. When to visit the doctor for memory loss. If you, a family member, or a friend has problems remembering recent events or thinking clearly, or has concerns about memory, talk with a doctor. Finding the cause of the problem is important for determining the best course of action. Healthcare professionals who specialize in Alzheimer's disease and other dementias can recommend ways to manage the problem and suggest treatments and services that may help. You also might want to consider participating in clinical trials or studies. Clinical trials are research studies that help test if a treatment, like a new drug, is safe and effective in people. People with and without memory problems can take part in clinical trials, which may help themselves, their families, or future generations. To find out more about participating in clinical trials, call the Alzheimer's and Related Dementias Education and Referral ADEAR Center toll-free at 800-438-4380 or visit www.nia.nih.gov/Alzheimer's/clinical-trials. For more information about forgetfulness, Alzheimer's and Related Dementias Education and Referral ADEAR Center 800-438-4380 toll-free ADEAR at nia.nih.gov www.alzheimers.gov. The National Institute on Aging's ADEAR Center offers information and publications in English and Spanish for families, caregivers, and professionals on diagnosis, treatment, patient care, caregiver needs, long-term care, education, and training, and research related to Alzheimer's and related dementias. Alzheimer's Association 800-272-3900 toll-free 866-403-3073 TTY toll-free info@alz.org www.alz.org. Alzheimer's Foundation of America 866-232-8484 toll-free info@alzfdn.org www.alzfdn.org. Elder Care Locator 800-677-1116 toll-free Elder Care Locator at n4a.org www.eldercare.acl.gov. National Library of Medicine Medline Plus www.medlineplus.gov. For more information on health and aging, contact National Institute on Aging Information Center 800-222-2225 toll-free 800-222-4225 TTY toll-free NIAIC at nia.nih.gov www.nia.nih.gov. Visit www.nia.nih.gov/health to find more health and aging information from NIA and subscribe to email alerts. Visit https://order.nia.nih.gov to order free print publications. Tips for dealing with forgetfulness. People with some forgetfulness can use a variety of techniques that may help them stay healthy and deal with changes in their thinking. Plan tasks, make to-do lists, and use memory aids like notes and calendars. Some people find they remember things better if they mentally connect them to a familiar name, song, book, or TV show. Keep up interests or hobbies and develop new ones, such as volunteering and visiting with family and friends. Prevent or control high blood pressure. To control or lower high blood pressure, your healthcare provider may suggest exercise, changes in your diet, and/or medications. These steps can help protect your brain and your heart. Engage in physical activity and exercise. Several studies have associated aerobic exercise, such as brisk walking, with better brain function, although more research is needed to say for certain whether exercise can help prevent or delay dementia. Exercise may also help relieve feelings of stress, anxiety, or depression. Eat healthy foods. A healthy diet can help reduce the risk of many chronic diseases and may also help keep your brain healthy. Limit alcohol use. Heavy or binge drinking over time can cause memory loss and permanent brain damage. Get enough sleep, generally 7 to 8 hours each night. End of AgePage. Forgetfulness. Knowing when to ask for help. By the National Institute on Aging, National Institutes of Health. Read by T.Y.Lee.
Coke of Norfolk, Father of Experimental Farms, by William MacDonald. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Seest thou a man diligent in his business? He shall stand before kings. He shall not stand before mean men. At the beginning of this article, we have quoted a text taken from the Proverbs of Solomon, which we believe can be applied more truthfully to the subject of our paper than to any other name conspicuous in the annuals of agriculture. For he was a man diligent in his business, and he stood before kings. Thomas William Coke of Holcombe, or Holyholme, Earl of Leicester, was the eldest son of Robert Wenman. He was born in the year 1752 and educated at Eton, after which he travelled abroad. On the death of his father, Coke was elected in his place as Member of Parliament for the county of Norfolk. He was then in his 22nd year. He entered the youngest member. His political career extended over a period of 57 years, and he finished up as Father of the House of Commons. His domestic life was singularly happy, very different from the sad state of his great contemporary Arthur Young, and in 1775 he married his cousin Jane Dutton, by whom he had 3 daughters. After her death in 1800, he remained a widower for 21 years, and then, at the age of 68, wedded a girl of 18, Lady Anne Keppel, by whom he had 5 sons and 1 daughter. Coke had the unique experience of being offered a peerage 7 times under 6 different prime ministers, and he was the first commoner raised to the peerage by Queen Victoria on her accession to the throne. In this connection, an amusing story is told. In the year 1817, Coke was called on to present, at a levee, a very forcible address to the Prince of Wales, who was then acting as regent, praying him to dismiss from his presence and council those advisers who, by their conduct, had proved themselves alike enemies to the throne and the people. The regent was warned of the proposal. Knowing that Coke valued his position as a commoner above everything else, he declared with an oath that, "If Coke of Norfolk enters my presence, by God I'll knight him." This speech was repeated to Coke. "If he dares," was the rejoinder, "by God I'll break his sword." Part of the estate of Holkham was formerly a series of salt marshes on the coast of the North Sea, and when Coke came into his property in 1776, a fateful year in the history of the British Empire, the surrounding district was little better than a rabbit warren, with long stretches of shingle and sand. Soon after Coke's marriage, when his wife remarked that she was going down to Norfolk, the witty old Lady Townsend said, "Then, my dear, all you will see will be one blade of grass and two rabbits fighting for that." The story of how Coke came to be a practical farmer is told in the third volume of the Journal of the Royal Agricultural Society of England, published in the year 1842. The article containing it was written by Earl Spencer, and is of special interest as he had it direct from the lips of Mr. Coke, then Lord Leicester, a short time before his death. When Coke entered into his heritage, he found that 5 leases were about to expire. These farms were held at a rental of 3 shillings and 6pence an acre, and in the previous leases they had been valued at 1 shilling and 6pence an acre. At that time the agriculture of Norfolk was of the poorest character, and we may judge of the quality of the Holkham land by comparing it with the average rent of 10 shillings an acre, which Arthur Young says prevailed at this time. Coke sent for the 2 tenants, Mr. Brett and Mr. Tan, and offered to renew their leases at a slightly higher figure, namely 5 shillings an acre. Both refused, and Mr. Brett jeered at the suggestion, saying that the land was not worth even the 1 shilling and 6pence an acre which had originally been paid for it. This curt refusal was enough for a man of Coke's temperament. He forthwith decided to farm the land himself. It was thus that a young man of 22, possessor of a princely fortune, fresh from the salons of Europe, suddenly turned his back on a gay and fashionable world, and, stung into action by the laughter of a lazy tenant, took up the management of a sterile farm, raised a parish from poverty to affluence, transformed a desolate county into a cornfield, and left a name renowned in the annals of English agriculture. In the history of agriculture, the name of Coke is chiefly remembered by those famous gatherings locally known as Coke's Clippings. These wonderful meetings began in a simple way with a clipping or shearing of sheep, but soon came to embrace the whole realm of the rural industry. As might be imagined, when Coke took over the management of his farms, he had not the slightest knowledge of the science and practice of agriculture, so he called together his neighbours and frankly asked their advice. They in turn were doubtless glad to meet a young man so keen and so eager to learn. Soon they brought their friends and their relatives, and 2 years later these little country gatherings had assumed a more definite character, and were thereupon called Coke's clippings. Soon agriculturalists from all parts of Great Britain wrote to ask if they might attend. Swiftly and steadily the fame of the clippings grew, till presently scientific and other celebrated men from the United States and the Continent travelled to England to take part in these meetings. Year by year they increased in numbers, till at last they embraced every nationality, every profession, and every rank in life, from royalty to the poorest peasant. Holkham had, in fact, become a great experimental farm, a private estate turned by the enterprise of its owner into a public institution. Nowadays we are familiar with state experimental farms, which are visited by thousands of farmers once or twice a year. But a century ago such a thing was unheard of, and Coke may justly be termed the father of the experimental farm. At these shearings, Coke presented many cups and prizes for the invention of any new agricultural implement, for suggestions with regard to improved systems of cropping, of irrigation, of enriching the soil, and for articles on agricultural subjects. In a word, to everyone who contributed to advance any branch whatsoever of the agricultural industry. Moreover, we are told that at a meeting of 1803, sweepstakes were offered for guessing the correct weight of a wether. The winner was a certain Mr. Moneyhill, who guessed the exact weight, 130 pounds, while a butcher named Rhett was a good second, and he guessed the weights of 4 other sheep within 1 pound. It is said that, one year, there died on the Holkham estate a tenant who had won no less than £800 in prizes at the clippings. Party politics were carefully excluded from these meetings, and any attempt to introduce a party spirit into the speeches at the annual dinners was at once silenced by Coke. As a politician he was a prominent Whig, but as an agriculturalist he sank his politics and opened his doors to men of merit, irrespective of their views. Thus he gave Sir John Sinclair a magnificent goblet as a token of his appreciation of Sinclair's Code of Agriculture, in spite of the fact that Sir John was a strong supporter of the vile Tories and their viler head, Mr. Pitt. Sir John was pleased beyond measure, and remarked, with a true Highland courtesy, that hitherto the most priceless heirloom in his castle had been the drinking cup of Mary Queen of Scots, but henceforth he would look on the goblet of his Whig friend as his greatest treasure. The last of Coke's clippings took place in the year 1821. It was attended by 7,000 people and lasted 3 whole days. There is something very pleasing in the account of this pastoral scene. A stately mansion in a splendid park, with a group of village maidens spinning flax on a velvet lawn in the midst of a vast concourse of people drawn from all parts of the earth. Punctually at 10 o'clock in the morning, so we read, Miss Coke came onto the lawn accompanied by her father and the Duke of Sussex. Then, after greetings taken and greetings given, the vast crowd proceeded, some riding, some driving, some walking, to inspect the different farms on the estate, The first day was given up to the study of the inoculated pasture, prize cattle, new implements, sheep shearing amid farm crops. The second day was devoted to fresh fields, farm schools and cottage gardens. The third day was absorbed in the inspection of the carcasses of animals that had been slaughtered, speech-making and the distribution of prizes. On that day at 3 p.m, 700 guests sat down to dinner, a midday meal, which, with the speeches and prizes, lasted for 7 hours. The historian of this period has left us an account of the most popular toasts at these annual banquets, such as a fine fleece and a fat carcass, the plough and a good use of it, while the tribute to Coke's efforts to enclose all waste lands always brought down the house, for it wittily ran, the enclosing of all wastes, and Coke's own toast, live and let live, was invariably greeted with tumultuous applause. The two annalists who have left us unimpeachable accounts of those memorable meetings are both agreed that Coke himself was the central figure. Dr. Rigby in Holcomb and its Agriculture, 1818, writes, "He is everywhere and with everyone. He solicits enquiry from everyone." At each halt in the ride, little knots of people collected round him and listened with absorbed interest to all he said, while for hours he thus sustained the character of leader, lecturer, and host. And the American ambassador of that day, His Excellency Mr. Richard Rush, writes in A Residence at the Court of London, "No matter what the subsequent advance of English agriculture or its results, Mr. Coke will ever take honourable rank among the pioneers of the great work. Come what will in the future, the Holcomb sheep shearings will live in English rural annals. Long will tradition speak of them as uniting improvements in agriculture, an abundant, cordial and joyous hospitality." When Coke started to farm in Norfolk, the value of rotation was unknown. Then it was customary to grow 3 white straw crops in succession, followed by broadcast turnips. It was not to be wondered at that soil which consisted mainly of drifting sand and sharp, flinty gravel should soon become worn out. Coke changed this practice and grew only 2 white crops in succession, and then let the land lie in pasture for the next 2 years. He began to manure heavily, and used rape cake as a top dressing with marked success. Moreover, he found that the soil of almost the whole district was composed of very light sand and underlaid with a stratum of rich marl. Pits were opened, the marl dug out and scattered over the surface of the land. This not only promoted fertility, but gave to the soil that solidity which is so essential to the growth of wheat. It was Coke's proud boast that he turned West Norfolk from a rye-growing into a wheat-growing district. But it took him 11 years before he could get wheat to grow on the poor sandy soil of his own estate. Nevertheless, before he died, these so-called rabbit and rye lands were yielding as much as 32 bushels to the acre. His main idea was to stock heavily, more for the sake of manure than for the sake of meat. He pinned his faith on the motto, "Muck is the mother of money." And we are told that he was accustomed to say to his tenants, "If you will keep an extra yard of bullocks, I will build you a yard and sheds free of expense." He was a patient man, but he was once heard to remark, "It is difficult to teach anything to adult ignorance. I had to contend with prejudice, ignorant impatience of change, and a rooted attachment to old methods." He referred to the fact that the farmers still persisted in the old system of sowing cereals broadcast, or else laboriously made holes with a dibbing iron into which the grain was dropped, while another man followed with a rake and covered up the holes. Thus he used the drill for 16 years before any of his neighbours could be induced to adopt it. And even when the farmers began at last to see the benefit of this rapid manner of sowing, he estimated that its spread was only a mile each year. By and by, however, he noticed that a quaint term for a good crop of barley had come into use at Holkham. His farmers spoke of hat barley, for the reason that if a man throws his hat into a crop of barley, the hat rests on the surface if the crop is good, but falls to the ground if the crop is bad. "All, sir," said his tenants at length, "is hat barley since the drill came." Coke was never tired of experimenting with every kind of crop. Cocksfoot, or orchard grass, was cultivated with great success, and numbers of sheep were fattened on it. On land once considered worthless, he cut 400 tons of sainfoin from 104 acres. He early recognised the merits of Swedes, and was the first to grow them on a large scale. He made a special study of birds in relation to the eradication of grubs. Finding a field of turnips infested with a larva which caused black canker, he turned 400 ducks into the field, which they cleared of this pest in 5 days. Early in his career, Coke discarded the native sheep of Norfolk, with backs as narrow as rabbits, in favour of the South Downs, and gradually became one of the largest sheep breeders in England. Encouraged by the Duke of Bedford, another eminent agriculturalist, he started a herd of North Devons, and thereafter bred them with much success. He also improved the Suffolk breed of pigs by crossing them with the Neapolitan, thereby obtaining a superior quality of pork. Afforestation was one of his special hobbies. He fully realised the truth of the old saying that a tree is growing while its planter is sleeping. Every year he planted 50 acres of timber, mostly oak, Spanish chestnut and beech, till he had 3,000 acres of bleak, wind-swept country well covered. He permitted the poor of the neighbourhood to plant potatoes among his young trees for 2 or 3 years, a practice which kept his land clean and saved the expense of hoeing. And in the year 1832 he embarked in a ship built of oak from the acorns which he himself had planted. He always maintained that the interests of landlord and tenant were identical. In order, therefore, to encourage his tenants to exert themselves to the utmost, he let out his farms on long leases of 21 years at a moderate rental and burdened with but few restrictions. He soon saw, however, that in the case of an indolent tenant, a long lease would mean the rapid deterioration of the property. It happened at this time that a certain farmer named Mr. Overman, who had been foremost in furthering the new agricultural schemes, applied for a farm on the Holkham estate. Coke allowed him, as an experiment, to draw up the covenants of his own lease. Overman straightway inserted a clause making the improved course of cropping compulsory. Coke was so pleased that he at once made this lease the model for all his other tenants, with a few slight modifications. And so the land was fully protected from any possible injury through a long period of bad farming. By such improved methods, Coke is said to have raised the annual rental of his estate from £2,200 to £20,000, while the yearly fall of timber and underwood averaged £2,700, a sum which exceeded the whole of his old rent roll. During his 66 years at Holkham, he spent over £500,000 on improvements alone, without taking into account the large sums spent on his house, domain, and home farm buildings. Yet it is averred that this vast outlay was all regained in due course. At that period, the Holkham estate consisted of 4,300 acres in a ring fence, with a park of 3,500 acres surrounded by a 10-mile wall close to the sea. In a volume entitled Agricultural Writers, 1200 to 1800 AD, by Donald MacDonald, the name of Coke does not appear, and it would seem that all he ever wrote were some papers for the Annals of Agriculture by Arthur Young, and a pamphlet on An Address to the Freeholders of Norfolk. The biography of this remarkable man has recently been written in 2 brightly bound and lavishly illustrated volumes by Mrs. A. M. W. Stirling, under the title of Coke and His Friends. His memory well deserved the laborious and loving tribute of his enthusiastic great-grandchild. But to be of any practical value to the agriculturalist, the book must be greatly condensed. Out of 35 chapters, we can find only 5 which tell of his services to the agricultural industry. Out of 1,000-odd pages, we can find only 116 which bear on the science and practice of farming. Out of 64 carefully executed illustrations, we can only find 4 which have anything whatsoever to do with rural affairs. It may be affirmed that Coke was much more than a mere agriculturalist. That is very true, but surely his fame rests far more on his services to rural progress than on his reputation as a politician, a society leader, or a landlord. We therefore hope that at no distant date the same flowing pen which has produced the bulkier volumes will compile a handier life dealing together with Coke's agricultural doings. Coke died in 1842 at the age of 88 and was buried in the family mausoleum attached to the Tattershall Church, Norfolk. In a life drama so vivid and forceful, there are yet 2 vivid scenes we cannot fail to recall. It was Coke who brought forward the motion in the House of Commons to recognise the independence of the American colonies. All night long the House sat. At 8:30 a.m. the end came. Amid breathless silence the result was announced: 177 noes, 178 ayes. It was Coke who announced to the obstinate, discomfited king the result of that great debate, whereby the disastrous fratricidal war was forever ended and the independence of the United States acknowledged by the Parliament of the mother country, after 9 bitter years, by a majority of 1 vote. The parish of Burnham lies next to the parish of Holcombe, and the son of the rector of the former village, a fragile, delicate lad, used sometimes to join Mr. Coke's hounds when they were out coursing, but he was never asked to shoot, as only once had he been known to hit a partridge. One day this poor young man, returning from a 2 years' cruise, paid a visit to his wealthy neighbour and stayed overnight. The great-uncle of his host built the mansion house of Holcombe, and Thomas William Coke spent all his life and a large fortune in developing the family estate. But the British people placed Nelson, the frail and nervous guest who slept that night in the humble turret room, on the top of the column in the centre of Trafalgar Square. End of Coke of Norfolk, Father of Experimental Farms, by William MacDonald.
Cranks. Chapter 1 of The Hollow Earth by F.T. Ives. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Cranks. Cranks are appliances to turn things round. A crank that revolves only halfway will not always accomplish much of a change, and in many cases would only aggravate the situation. Were it not for cranks, nearly all mechanical appliances would be motionless. Men's thoughts and opinions would all be the same without some such device to get them out of the old notions, grooves, and ruts in which they long have indulged and plodded. The world has known cranks ever since our first parents adopted the wearing of fig leaves and Noah took up shipbuilding on the Weather Bureau suggesting cloudy weather and showers in eastern Turkey. Moses was a crank when he forbid the eating of pork, saltwater eels, turkey, buzzards, owls, and all other unclean birds, fish, or animals of any kind. But there is no doubt that these commands were none of his mistakes. Sacred writ gives us plenty of such characters, but, by skipping to times more recent, we find such cranks as Copernicus, Galileo, Columbus, Newton, Franklin, and, during the last century, the crank family has greatly increased with Daguerre, Watt, Howe, Edison, Marconi, and Tesla, and scores of others, who in some of the earlier times would have been hung or burned as wizards and sorcerers. Political, historical, and religious cranks have sprung up, turning over and upsetting many old fogey and absurd notions and beliefs of the past. In former times, cranks were the subject of ridicule and persecution for trying to inject some new ideas into the public mind. History is profuse with abuses of some of the best thoughts and discoveries that have come to the human race. Supposing Copernicus had never advanced and enforced a conclusion that the earth was round and revolved on its axis, such motion causing the apparent rising and setting of the sun. Only for this we might to this day believe in the story of Joshua's command over the sun and moon, and associate believers with Parson Jasper that the sun do move. It is pleasant to realize that we are living in a time when new thoughts do not frighten people, and we are not scared at what we cannot understand, even if it does not harmonize with antiquated ideas purporting to be 4,000 to 6,000 years old. The humble and obscure individual who presumes to offer the few succeeding pages of crude ideas may be classed among pygmy cranks, but nevertheless feels impelled to sow a little thoughtful seed on a subject that, to his knowledge, has never been discussed, and with a hope that such seed may, some of it, fall in good ground and spring up a crop of criticism that may ultimate in some better mind taking it up and demonstrate with the success that the writer believes it merits. To prove that the earth was round required a long time and a serious amount of persecution. Now, to assume that it is hollow may require more time than the brief discussion in this small book. Yet, it is hoped the ideas here may take root in the enlightenment of the present day and start a growth productive of good fruit in the future. In order to discuss this question involves a task that, in the outset, may look discouraging as follows. The axe must be laid at the root of many favorite and long-accepted beliefs laid down by scientific authorities to explain the principal phenomena of disturbances on and in the Mother Earth, and to overthrow nearly all accepted theories on the following subjects. The assumption that the earth is intensely hot or in a molten state in its interior, the presumption that it is a solid ball, the supposition that there is an actual pole, that hills and mountains are always results of volcanoes, that volcanoes are a prime or natural existence, that living springs and lakes are results of surface influence, the theories of the Gulf Stream, icebergs and the ice belt, their formation, glaciers, how formed, equable condition of the Mediterranean Sea, and the law of attraction of gravitation, or that the sun is a mass of heat. End of Cranks, Chapter 1 of The Hollow Earth by F.T. Ives, read by Phineas.
Down the River of Doubt with Theodore Roosevelt, from Dark Trails by George K. Cherry. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Late July 1913 was very hot. Even at my home among the green Vermont hills, there was no doubt of it. I was lounging in comfortable fashion in the shade of an apple tree when a letter postmarked New York was handed to me. The note was from Dr. Frank M. Chapman of the American Museum of Natural History, and queried my willingness to make another South American expedition. Having just returned from my 25th trip to that country, my enthusiasm did not break bounds. However, 10 days later I went to New York for a conference. There I learned it was proposed that I should accompany Colonel Roosevelt, ex-President of the United States, to the interior of Brazil as naturalist of his expedition. We met at luncheon, the Colonel, Dr. Chapman, and I, and discussed plans for making zoological collections for the museum in connection with the trip. Later, Chapman and I arranged details regarding my outfit and supplies. Although the arrangements for my collecting were made between Chapman and me, the Colonel, nevertheless, asked for an occasional conference with me. At these conferences he displayed an eager interest in the animal life of tropical Brazil, and I was struck by his general knowledge of natural history. I have a vivid recollection of one of our discussions. The Colonel, having satisfied himself regarding various matters, probably considered the conference at an end, and had returned to his desk. I tarried, for I had no previous close acquaintance with Colonel Roosevelt, and felt uneasy as to what his opinion might be regarding some of my personal habits. At any rate, I spoke to him and said, "Colonel Roosevelt, I think you should know a little bit about me before we start on this journey into the wilderness." "Well," said Colonel, without turning around, "what is it, Mr. Cherry?" "I think," I said, You should know that I occasionally drink." The colonel went on writing. I waited. It seemed to me a very long time. Then he whirled around in his chair and looked me straight in the eye and said, "Cherry, you say you drink?" "Yes," I replied. "I occasionally take a drink." "What do you drink?" And I replied, "Well, Colonel, that depends a good deal on what is available." "How much do you drink?" "All that I want." The colonel shook a finger at me and said, "Cherry, just keep right on drinking." Then he turned to his desk and continued his writing. The interview was at an end. Before sailing and during the voyage, we discussed many routes that we might follow through Brazil, but not until we had reached Rio de Janeiro was it definitely settled where we were to go. There we first learned of the River of Doubt. Colonel Rondon, a famous Brazilian explorer, had recently terminated an expedition on which he had discovered the headwaters of an hitherto unknown river. He named his discovery the Rio de la Duvida, because he did not know what its course might be. During a conference with Brazil's Minister of Foreign Affairs, that official volunteered the cooperation of his government in the exploration of this unknown river. The idea appealed to Colonel Roosevelt's imagination, and he immediately accepted the offer. So it was that 2 months later we were on our way up the Paraguay River and its tributary, the Sepotuba, to a military station where the Brazilian government had assembled for us mule and oxen transportation across the tableland of central Brazil. After 37 days in the saddle, we reached the point on the River of Doubt at which Colonel Rondon had turned back. Here we secured from the Indians 7 dugout canoes, in which we embarked on a journey of peril and adventure such as none of us had ever contemplated. Nearly 2 months were spent in descending that unknown river. We lost 6 of the 7 canoes with which we started and built 5 new ones during our journey. Some of our men died terrible deaths in the rapids. We had a murder in camp. We all suffered from fever. For days we were hungry. At one time, Colonel Roosevelt was so ill that I wrote in my diary, "I don't believe he can live through the night." Such briefly were some of the unforgettable incidents of that journey. I realized that no one individual could have seen all that happened on such an expedition, and that no 2 people see the details of any occurrence from exactly the same angle. Neither do 2 people interpret what they see in the same terms. It will not be surprising, therefore, if my account of some of our experiences do not always agree with those of the Colonel, as set down in his book, Through the Brazilian Wilderness. I have always felt that Colonel Roosevelt did not give adequate stress to many of the daily occurrences. I am sure he did not attach sufficient importance to his own part in our many adventures. To illustrate my point, let me quote from my diary a part of an entry made at Aranpindinha, our 20th camp on the unknown river, March 27th, 1914. Twice today we had to portage our cargoes, but were able to run the canoes down through the rapids. At the first series of rapids we narrowly escaped a serious loss. 3 of the boatmen were bringing down the larger of our balsas. In attempting to make an abrupt turn in the run through a narrow channel near the shore that was bordered with sharp, jagged rocks, overhung with vines and creepers, the canoes were entangled by the overhanging vines and thrown out of their course. In the fraction of a second, the racing current had wrenched the boats apart. One was caught on the rocks and capsized, the prow of the other being driven beneath it. Both canoes filled instantly with water, but the swift current swept them against the protruding rocks, where they were held as in a vice, instead of being whirled away to be crushed amid the boulders in the main channel below. I heard the screams of the canoemen and rushed up to help. On seeing what had happened, I turned and ran down to the foot of the carry where the other members of the party were waiting. On giving the alarm, everyone, including Colonel Roosevelt, hurried back along the shore. By our combined efforts, and working in the rushing water up to our waists, we were able to raise the canoes, one at a time, get the water out of them, and hold them until a canoeman with a steering paddle was ready to direct their course through the rock-bound channel down to quiet waters. There were many anxious, strenuous moments before the danger was past. While assisting in the salvaging of the two canoes, the colonel struck his shin against a sharp edge of rock, inflicting an ugly wound which did not completely heal until after we had left Brazil. The wound he received that day, I have always felt, was responsible for much of his suffering during the remainder of the journey. It became infected and remained as a running sore. His rushing into the water to assist was entirely characteristic of him, and he did this after many days of suffering from fever which had weakened his vitality. He could not stand idly watching others at a time when action was required. In the weeks of trying hardship, when the fate seemed all against us, despite the fever and dysentery that were sapping his strength, he never failed, day after day, to make inquiry about his camp companions, including the canoemen and camp helpers. We finally reached the point on the river where it cuts its course through a narrow canyon, and where the difficulties of passing our canoes seemed insuperable. At this point, some of our companions advised abandoning the canoes, which meant that everyone must fight for himself through the forest. Although too sick to walk, there was no word of complaint from the colonel. But that night he called his son Kermit and me to his side and said, "Boys, I realize that some of us are not going to finish this journey. I know that I am only a burden to the rest of you." Turning to me, he added, "Jerry, I want you and Kermit to go on. I want you to get out. I will stop here." Of course, we refused to listen to any such plan, and finally convinced him that we would not go on without him. All told, I have made a great many journeys to out-of-the-way places, 38 of them to the land of the conquistadores, that fascinating land of romance and adventure. But this expedition, with Roosevelt as leader and comrade, marked a high spot in my career. It brought me experiences and associations which are among my most cherished memories. I have had companions, good, bad, and indifferent. Only one, Theodore Roosevelt, remains in my memory as the ideal campmate. End of Down the River of Doubt with Theodore Roosevelt by George K. Cherry. Read by Phil Schempf.
Dreams and Omens and Media of Communication Between Gods and Men by Edward Clodd. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Public Domain Scholar. Dreams as Omens and Media of Communication Between Gods and Men. Reference has now been made to the part played by dreams as supposed channels of communication between heaven and earth, as portents, omens, etc. The common belief among the nations of antiquity that they were sent by the gods, and the like belief lurking in the minds of the superstitious to this day, are the scarcely altered survivals of barbaric confusion respecting them. When men had advanced from the earlier stages of undefined wonder and bewilderment concerning the powers around and above him to anthropomorphic conceptions of them, i.e., to making them in his own image, the events of his dreams were striking confirmation of his notions about the constant intervention of spiritual beings, gods, chiefs, and ancestors in the affairs of life. That personal life and will with which the root intelligence invests the objects of its all. Waving trees, swirling waters, drifting clouds, whirling winds, stately march of sun and star seemed especially manifest in dreams and visions. In their unrelated and bewildering, or, on the other hand, their surpassing clear incidents, the powers indwelling in all things seemed to come nearer than in the less sensational occurrences of the day, uttering their monitions, or making known their will. They were the media by which this and that thing was commanded or forbidden, or by which guidance and counsel and knowledge of the future were given. To induce them, therefore, became a constant effort. The discovery that fasting is a certain method of procuring them is one reason of its prevalence in the lower culture. Amongst all the indigenous races of North America, abstinence has been practiced as a chief means of securing supernatural inspiration. The redskin to become a sorcerer or to secure a revelation from his totem, or the Eskimo to become an angekok, will endure the most severe privations. It is believed that whatever is seen in the first dream, thus produced by fasting, becomes the Manitou or guardian spirit of life, corresponding to the daimon of Socrates, and whoever by much fasting is favored with dreams, and cultivates the art of explaining them as bearing on the future, becomes the feared and consulted medicine man of his tribe. His kike winds or records are finally shown to the old people, who meet together and consult upon them. They in the end give their approval and declare that he is gifted as a prophet, is inspired with wisdom, and is fit to lead in the councils of the people. Very slender data were needed for the conclusions first drawn from dreams. Let the death of a friend or foe be the incident, and the event happen. Let a hunting path fill the half-torpid fancy, and a day's fasting follow. Let the mother of a young sportsman dream that she saw a bear in a certain place, and the son, guided by her account, find the bear where indicated, and kill it. The arbitrary relation is set up forthwith, as Lord Bacon says, men mark the hits, but not the misses, and 1,000 dreams unfulfilled count as nothing against one dream fulfilled. Out of that is shaped, as dream lore shows, a canon of interpretation by which whole races will explain their dreams, never staying, when experience happens to confirm it, to wonder that the correspondences are not more frequent than they are. Where the arbitrary act was wrought, the isolated or conflicting influences manifest, their deity or demon was working. So the passage from the crude interpretation of his dreams by the barbarian to the formal elaboration of the dream oracle is obvious. It was only one of many modes by which the gods were thought to hold converse with men, and by which their will was divined. It was one phase of that many-sided belief in power, for good or evil, inhering in everything, and which led man to see omens in the common events of life, in births, in the objects anyone met in a journey or saw in the sky, to divine the future by numbers, by the lines in the hand, by the song and flight of birds, lurking in the word augury, by the entrails of sacrificed men and animals. Sometimes the god sends the message through a spiritual being, an angel, literally messenger. Sometimes he himself speaks in vision, but more often through the symbolism of both familiar and unfamiliar things. To interpret this as a serious science, and skill and shrewdness applied therein with success, were passports to high place and royal favor. In this we have the familiar illustrations of Joseph and Daniel, and indeed we need not travel beyond the books of the Old Testament for abundant and varied examples of the importance attached to dreams and visions, and of the place accorded to dreams, an importance undiminished until we come to the literature of the centuries just before Christ. For example, in the book of Jesus, the son of Sirach, we read, "Vain and deceitful hopes befit the senseless man, and dreams make fools rejoice. Like one who grasps at a shadow and chases the wind, is he who puts trust in dreams." In the belief that through dreams and oracles Yahweh made known his will, the influence of older beliefs and their literature is apparent. Among the Akkadians, a pre-Semitic race in Babylonia, there existed a mass of treatises on magic and divination by dreams and visions, and both from this and from Egyptian sources, blended with survivals from their barbaric past, the Hebrews largely drew. In this, too, there is nothing new under the sun. Homer, painting the vividness and agonizing incompleteness of the passing visions, affirms that dreams from Jove proceed, although sometimes to deceive men. Plato assigns prophetic character to the images seen in them. Aristotle sees a divination concerning some things in dreams, which is not incredible. The answer to oracles was sought in them, as when the worshipper slept in a temple on the skin of a sacrificed ram, and learned his destiny through the dream that came. The Stoics argued that if the gods love and care for men and are all-knowing, they will tell their purposes to men in sleep. Cicero attaches high importance to the faculty of interpreting them. Their phenomena, like those of oracles and predictions, should, he contends, be explained just as the grammarians and the commentators explain the poets. With the influence of these beliefs in the air, and with the legend visions of Scripture as authority, the divine origin of dreams became a doctrine of the Christian Church. Tertullian says that, "We receive dreams from God, there being no man so foolish as never to have known any dreams come true." And in his De Anima, reference is made to a host of writers of dream treatises. For the most part, they are but names. Their treatises have perished, but enough remains for the perusal of the curious regarding ancient rules of interpretation and the particular significance of certain dreams. The current views of dreams in classical antiquity are believed to be partly embodied in the Orina Critica of Artemidorus of Ephesus, who flourished about the middle of the 2nd century, and who reduces dream interpretation to a body of elaborate rules. While amongst Christian writers, Synesius of Cyrene, who lived 2 centuries later, holds a corresponding place. Both classical and patristic writers supply copious details concerning the classes into which dreams were divided, and which have some curious correspondences among the Oriental nations, as well as in our dream lore, e.g., when Artemidorus says that he who dreams he hath lost a tooth shall lose a friend. We may compare with this a quotation which Brand gives from the Sappho and Foe of Lily, a playwright of the time of Elizabeth. Dreams have their truth. Dreams are but doubtings, which come either by things we see in the day or meats that we eat, and so the common sense preferring it to be the imaginative. I dreamed, says Ismena, mine eye-tooth was loose, and that I thrust it out with my tongue. It foretelleth, replies Meleta, the loss of a friend, and I ever thought thee so full of prattle that thou wouldst thrust out the best friend with thy tattling. It is, however, needless to quote from Artemidorus and others of their kin. They do but furnish samples of the ingenuity applied to profitless speculations on matters which were fundamental then and around which the mind played, unchecked and unchallenged. Moreover, the subtle distinctions made between dreams and former times were slowly effaced or sank to their proper level in the gossip of chapbooks. Our European Kike wins. But the belief in the dream as having a serious meaning and in the spectral appearances and visions as real existences remained as strong as in any barbarian or pagan. In an atmosphere charged with the supernatural, apparitions and the like were matters of course, the particular form of the illusion to which the senses testified being in harmony with the ideas of the age. The devil does not appear to Greek or Roman, but he sorely troubled the saints, unless their nerves were, like Luther's, strong enough to overmaster him. Luther speaks of him as coming into a cell and making a great noise behind the stove, and of his walking in the cloister above his cell at night. But as I knew it was the devil, he says, I paid no attention to him and went to sleep. Skeptics now and again arose, protesting against the current belief, but they were as a voice crying in the desert. One Henry Cornelius Agrippa, in the 15th century, a man born out of due time, says, "To this delusion not a few great philosophers have given not a little credit, especially Democritus, Aristotle, Cinxius, etc., so far building on examples of dreams, which some accident hath made to be true, that thence they endeavor to persuade men that there are no dreams but what are real." His words have not yet lost their purport, or the credulity of man, the persistence with which he clings to the shadow of the supernatural after having surrendered the substance, seem almost a constant quantity, varying only in form. Unteachable by experience, fools still pay their guineas to mediums to rap out inane messages from the departed and send postage stamps to the astronomer royal asking him to work the planets for them and secure them luck and love and lawsuits. Nor is there any cure for this but in wise culture of the mind, wise correction, and wholesome control of the emotions. By faithfully intending the mind to the realities of nature, as Bacon has it, and by living and working among men in a healthy, sympathetic way, exaggeration of a particular line of thought or feeling is prevented, and the balance of the faculties best preserved. For, adds Dr. Maudsley, in pregnant and well-chosen words, there are not two worlds, a world of nature and a world of human nature, standing over against one another in a sort of antagonism, but one world of nature, in the orderly evolution of which human nature has its subordinate part. Delusions and hallucinations may be described as discordant notes in the grand harmony. It should then be every man's steadfast aim, as a part of nature, his patient work, to cultivate such entire sincerity of relations with it, so to think, feel, and act always in intimate unison with it, to be so completely one with it in life, that when the summons comes to surrender his mortal part to absorption into it, he does so, not fearfully, as to an enemy who has vanquished him, but trustfully, as to a mother who, when the day's task is done, bids him lie down to sleep. End of Dreams as Omens and Media of Communication Between Gods and Men by Edward Claude.
The Effect of Overlearning on Retention by C. F. Kruger, Psychological Laboratory, University of Chicago. Recorded by Leon Harvey for LibriVox.org. This experiment is concerned with the following problems. 1. As the degree of learning is varied from 100% to 200%, will the degree of retention vary proportionally, i.e., will 50% overlearning increase the amount retained by 50%, or by some other proportion? 2. Will the relation between the degree of retention and the degree of learning vary with the interval between learning and recall? For example, if 50% overlearning increases retention by 40% after a one-day interval, will this latter percentage increase or decrease with the length of the interval? La obtained results bearing upon these problems. The subjects, college students, and one instructor memorized series of nonsense syllables of 12 each. The lists were presented on a memory drum, each word being exposed for 2 seconds. Only one degree of overlearning was used, namely 150% learning. The intervals between learning and recall were 4 hours, 1 day, and 2 days. Retention was tested by the methods of unaided written reproduction, recognition, and reconstruction. The increase of retention was always less than the degree of overlearning. The ratio of retentive increase to the degree of overlearning decreases with the interval, and in some cases overlearning even proved detrimental. For example, when retention was measured by written reproduction, the 4-hour interval showed an increase of 17.1%, while a 1-day interval gave an actual decrease of 7.1%, and the 2-day interval showed a decrease of 10.6%. The results were approximately the same for all 3 methods of measuring retention. The present experiment was designed to supplement and to extend Lull's work by employing 2 degrees of overlearning and a wider range of intervals. Our experimental conditions differ from Lull's in the following respects. Instead of a series of 12 nonsense syllables, we used lists of 12 monosyllabic nouns. We had 2 degrees of overlearning, 50% and 100%. The range of intervals in our experiment was 1, 2, 4, 7, 14, and 28 days. Retention was tested 1. by anticipatory verbal recall and 2. by the saving method. A list of words was presented by means of a memory drum at the rate of 2 seconds per word. S was permitted to use any method of memorizing except that of writing down the words. The usual anticipatory method, verbal recall, was employed to test the degree of learning, but the anticipatory test was given in alternate trials instead of in every trial, as is usual. By 100% learning, we mean the degree or stage of perfection at which S was first able to anticipate correctly all the words in the list in a single presentation. To obtain 50% overlearning, the presentations were continued until the number was increased by 1/2 of the number of trials required for the 100% degree of mastery, and 100% overlearning was given twice the number of trials necessary just to learn a list. If, for example, 10 trials were needed to learn a list, 100%, 5 more was the number arbitrarily set for 50% overlearning. If 12 trials were necessary, 6 more were added, etc. Only 1 new list was learned on any one day. Different groups of subjects were utilized for the various intervals, but the lists employed were the same throughout. For each interval, the same group was used for the 3 degrees of learning. 2 methods were employed to eliminate the possibility that the difference between the 3 learning and retention scores might be due to practice. 1. All subjects were first required to memorize 4 practice lists before being tested. 2. One half took the three conditions in the order of 100%, 150%, and 200% learning, while the other half took in the reverse order of 200%, 150%, and 100% learning. To avoid the possibility that the differences in retention were due to differences in the difficulty of the lists, each of 20 subjects learned a different list for a given degree of mastery. Thus, the average for each condition was based upon the retention scores for 20 lists. There was one exception. For each degree of learning, with a one-day interval, the averages were computed from 40 retention scores, or 20 scores from each of the 20 lists. After the specified interval, the subjects were required to relearn the lists up to a 100% stage of mastery. The subjects were tested by the anticipatory method of verbal recall on the odd-numbered trials. This gave us two measures of retention. 1. The number of words correctly anticipated on the first presentation, and 2. The percentage of saving based upon learning and relearn scores. Table 1 is displayed on the page. Average number of trials to learn and relearn a list. Table 1 is found for each of the 18 conditions. The average number of trials necessary: 1. To learn, and 2. To relearn a list. Column 3 states the average number of trials necessary to memorize a list to the specific degrees of learning. The fourth column gives the average number of trials required to attain a 100% degree of learning. The seventh column records the average number of trials required to relearn each list. All averages are based on 20 measures, with the exception of those for the one-day interval, which are based upon 40 scores. The other columns give the measures of variability, such as the SDs and PEs, for each average. By inspection, it may be seen that the learning scores, based upon 100% learning, were approximately the same for the 18 conditions. Thus, any differences in the amounts retained cannot be accounted for by differences in the learning scores. The retention scores are given in tables 2 and 3. The verbal recall scores, which are found in the third column of table 2, represent the average number of words recalled for each condition. In the next two columns of the same table are the standard deviations and probability events for the corresponding averages. The last two columns give the ratio of the difference between the two obtained means to the probability event difference. All values above 4 indicate a statistically significant difference between the two respective averages. Table 2 is displayed on the previous page. Average verbal recall score and reliability of the difference between obtained averages. Table 3 is displayed on the following page. Average percentage retained as measured by the saving method. Table 3 states the average retention scores for all conditions, as derived by the saving method. These values were computed by the usual formula from the 100% degree of learning and the relearning scores of Table 1. Column 3 gives the average percentage retained for each degree of learning and for the various intervals. The standard deviations and probability events of these averages are in the next two columns. The last two columns give the ratio of the difference between the respective means to the probability event difference. The retention scores of tables 2 and 3 show that for every interval the highest amount retained was for 100% overlearning, while 100% learning always gave the least score. The ratios of the differences between two obtained means to their probability events difference express a statistically valid difference between the two respective retention scores without a single exception. In order to discover whether the relation between the degree of learning and the degree of retention varies with the interval between learning and recall, we computed the ratios between the retention scores for 100% learning and 150% learning, and the ratios of retention scores for 150% learning and 200% learning. The respective degrees of learning stand in the ratios of 1 to 1.5 and 1 to 1.33. By dividing the retention scores for each interval by the retention scores for the lesser degree of learning, we get the corresponding ratios of retention. For example, according to Table 2, the retention scores for 100% and 150% learning for the one-day interval stand in the ratio of 3.10 to 4.60, and the retention scores for 150% and 200% learning are in the ratio of 4.60 to 5.83. By dividing the first ratio by 3.10 and the second ratio by 4.60, the retention scores for the lesser degree of learning, we obtain the simplified ratios of 1 to 1.48 and 1 to 1.27. These ratios mean that an increase of learning from 100% to 150% gave a corresponding increase in retention of 48%, while increased learning by an additional 33.33%, or 150% to 200%, increased retention only by 27%. Tables 4 and 6 give the two series of ratios for the verbal recall scores. By the same procedure, we computed the ratios of retention for the scores derived by the saving method. These ratios are found in tables 5 and 7. To illustrate the relative efficiency of overlearning for the various intervals, we see that, as stated in table 4, 50% overlearning increased retention, 48% for the 1-day interval, 100% for the 2-day interval, 310% for the 4-day interval, 550% for the 7-day interval, etc. The infinity score for 150% learning with a 28-day interval was due to the zero record for 100% learning. On the previous page, Table 4 is displayed. Ratio degree of learning and corresponding ratios for retention for 100% and 150% learning. Table 5. Ratio of degree of learning and corresponding ratios for retention for 100% and 150% learning. Table 6. Ratio of degree of learning and corresponding ratios of retention for 150% and 200% learning. Table 7. Ratio of degree of learning and corresponding ratios of retention for 100% and 150% learning. From tables 4, 5, 6, and 7, we may conclude that 1. As the degree of learning was increased from 100% to 150%, the corresponding increase in retention for the 1-day interval was approximately the same, and that this ratio increased rapidly as the length of the interval between learning and recall was extended. 2. As the degree of learning was increased from 150% to 200%, or by an additional 33.33%, the corresponding increase in retention was usually less, and this proportion did not vary consistently with the length of the interval. Our results thus directly contradict those of La. This divergency of results may be due to the differences in the conditions, difference in material, method of measurement, and length of the interval employed. Our results suggest that the third factor may be partially responsible. A certain degree of overlearning, at least 50%, is highly economical from the standpoint of retention for intervals of 2 to 28 days, and the larger the interval, the greater is the economy. Further increases of overlearning, however, prove to be uneconomical for most intervals. Manuscript received June 20, 1928. End of The Effect of Overlearning on Retention by C. F. Kruger.
The Eruption of Vesuvius by Pliny the Younger. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Letter 55 to Tacitus by Plinius Junior. Read by Thomas Copeland. To Tacitus. Your request that I would send you an account of my uncle's death, in order to transmit a more exact relation of it to posterity, deserves my acknowledgments, for if this accident shall be celebrated by your pen, the glory of it, I am well assured, will be rendered forever illustrious. And notwithstanding he perished by a misfortune, which, as it involved at the same time a most beautiful country in ruins, and destroyed so many populous cities, seems to promise him an everlasting remembrance, notwithstanding he has himself composed many and lasting works, yet I am persuaded the mentioning of him in your immortal writings will greatly contribute to render his name immortal. Happy I esteem those to be to whom, by provision of the gods, has been granted the ability either to do such actions as are worthy of being related, or to relate them in a manner worthy of being read. But peculiarly happy are they who are blessed with both these uncommon talents, in the number of which my uncle, as his own writings and your history will evidently prove, may justly be ranked. It is with extreme willingness, therefore, that I execute your commands, and should indeed have claimed the task if you had not enjoined it. He was at that time with the fleet under his command at Messinum. On the 24th of August, about 1 in the afternoon, my mother desired him to observe a cloud which appeared of a very unusual size and shape. He had just taken a turn in the sun, and, after bathing himself in cold water and making a light luncheon, gone back to his books. He immediately arose and went out upon a rising ground, from whence he might get a better sight of this very uncommon appearance. A cloud, from which mountain was uncertain at this distance, but it was found afterwards to come from Mount Vesuvius, was ascending, the appearance of which I cannot give you a more exact description of than by likening it to that of a pine tree, for it shot up to a great height in the form of a very tall trunk, which spread itself out at the top into a sort of branches, occasioned, I imagine, either by a sudden gust of air that impelled it, the force of which decreased as it advanced upwards, or the cloud itself, being pressed back again by its own weight, expanded in the manner I have mentioned. It appeared sometimes bright and sometimes dark and spotted, according as it was either more or less impregnated with earth and cinders. This phenomenon seemed to a man of such learning and research as my uncle extraordinary and worth further looking into. He ordered a light vessel to be got ready, and gave me leave if I liked to accompany him. I said I had rather go on with my work, and it so happened he had himself given me something to write out. As he was coming out of the house, he received a note from Rectina, the wife of Bassus, who was in the utmost alarm at the imminent danger which threatened her. For her villa lying at the foot of Mount Vesuvius, there was no way of escape but by sea. She earnestly entreated him, therefore, to come to her assistance. He accordingly changed his first intention, and what had begun from a philosophical, he now carries out in a noble and generous spirit. He ordered the galleys to be put to sea, and went himself on board with an intention of assisting not only Rectina, but the several other towns which lay thickly strewn along that beautiful coast. Hastening then to the place from whence others fled with the utmost terror, he steered his course direct to the point of danger, and with so much calmness and presence of mind as to be able to make and dictate his observations upon the motion and all the phenomena of that dreadful scene. He was now so close to the mountain that the cinders, which grew thicker and hotter the nearer he approached, fell into the ships, together with pumice stones and black pieces of burning rock. They were in danger, too, not only of being aground by the sudden retreat of the sea, but also from the vast fragments which rolled down from the mountain and obstructed all the shore. Here he stopped to consider whether he should turn back again, to which the pilot advising him, "Fortune," said he, "favours the brave. Steer to where Pomponianus is." Pomponianus was then at Stabiae, separated by a bay, which the sea, after several insensible windings, forms with the shore. He had already sent his baggage on board, for though he was not at that time in actual danger, yet being within sight of it, and indeed extremely near, if it should in the least increase, he was determined to put to sea as soon as the wind, which was blowing dead inshore, should go down. It was favourable, however, for carrying my uncle to Pomponianus, whom he found in the greatest consternation. He embraced him tenderly, encouraging and urging him to keep up his spirits, and, the more effectually to soothe his fears by seeming unconcerned himself, ordered a bath to be got ready, and then, after having bathed, sat down to supper with great cheerfulness, or, at least, which is just as heroic, with every appearance of it. Meanwhile broad flames shone out in several places from Mount Vesuvius, which the darkness of the night contributed to render still brighter and clearer. But my uncle, in order to soothe the apprehensions of his friend, assured him it was only the burning of the villages, which the country people had abandoned to the flames. After this he retired to rest, and it is most certain he was so little disquieted as to fall into a sound sleep, for his breathing, which on account of his corpulence was rather heavy and sonorous, was heard by the attendants outside. The court, which led to his apartment, being now almost filled with stones and ashes, if he had continued there any time longer, it would have been impossible for him to have made his way out. So he was awoke, and got up, and went to Pomponianus and the rest of his company, who were feeling too anxious to think of going to bed. They consulted together whether it would be most prudent to trust to the houses, which now rocked from side to side with frequent and violent concussions, as though shaken from their very foundations, or fly to the open fields, where the calcined stones and cinders, though light indeed, yet fell in large showers, and threatened destruction. In this choice of dangers they resolved for the fields, a resolution which, while the rest of the company were hurried into by their fears, my uncle embraced upon cool and deliberate consideration. They went out then, having pillows tied upon their heads with napkins, and this was their whole defence against the storm of stones that fell round them. It was now day everywhere else, but there a deeper darkness prevailed than in the thickest night, which, however, was in some degree alleviated by torches and other lights of various kinds. They thought proper to go farther down upon the shore to see if they might safely put out to sea, but found the waves still running extremely high and boisterous. There my uncle, laying himself down upon a sailcloth, which was spread for him, called twice for some cold water, which he drank, when immediately the flames, preceded by a strong whiff of sulphur, dispersed the rest of the party, and obliged him to rise. He raised himself up with the assistance of two of his servants, and instantly fell down dead, suffocated, as I conjecture, by some gross and noxious vapour, having always had a weak throat, which was often inflamed. As soon as it was light again, which was not till the third day after this melancholy accident, his body was found entire, and without any marks of violence upon it, in the dress in which he fell, and looking more like a man asleep than dead. During all this time my mother and I, who were at Misenum, but this has no connection with your history, and you did not desire any particulars besides those of my uncle's death, so I will end here, only adding that I have faithfully related to you what I was either an eye-witness of myself, or received immediately after the accident happened, and before there was time to vary the truth. You will pick out of this narrative whatever is most important, for a letter is one thing, a history another. It is one thing writing to a friend, another thing writing to the public. Farewell. Letter 66, to Cornelius Tacitus. The letter which, in compliance with your request, I wrote to you concerning the death of my uncle, has raised, it seems, your curiosity to know what terrors and dangers attended me while I continued at Misenum, for there I think my account broke off. Though my shocked soul recoils, my tongue shall tell. My uncle having left us, I spent such time as was left on my studies. It was on their account, indeed, that I had stopped behind, till it was time for my bath, after which I went to supper, and then fell into a short and uneasy sleep. There had been noticed for many days before a trembling of the earth, which did not alarm us much, as it is quite an ordinary occurrence in Campania, but it was so particularly violent that night that it not only shook but actually overturned, as it would seem, everything about us. My mother rushed into my chamber, where she found me rising in order to awaken her. We sat down in the open court of the house, which occupied a small space between the buildings and the sea. As I was at that time but 18 years of age, I know not whether I should call my behaviour in this dangerous juncture courage or folly, but I took up Livy, and amused myself with turning over that author, and even making extracts from him, as if I had been perfectly at my leisure. Just then a friend of my uncle's, who had lately come to him from Spain, joined us, and observing me sitting by my mother, with a book in my hand, reproved her for her calmness, and me at the same time for my careless security. Nevertheless, I went on with my author. Though it was now morning, the light was still exceedingly faint and doubtful. The buildings all around us tottered, and though we stood upon open ground, yet, as the place was narrow and confined, there was no remaining without imminent danger. We therefore resolved to quit the town. A panic-stricken crowd followed us, and, as to a mind distracted with terror, every suggestion seems more prudent than its own, pressed on us in dense array to drive us forward as we came out. Being at a convenient distance from the houses, we stood still in the midst of a most dangerous and dreadful scene. The chariots, which we had ordered to be drawn out, were so agitated backwards and forwards, though upon the most level ground, that we could not keep them steady, even by supporting them with large stones. The sea seemed to roll back upon itself, and to be driven from its banks by the convulsive motion of the earth. It is certain at least the shore was considerably enlarged, and several sea animals were left upon it. On the other side, a black and dreadful cloud, broken with rapid zigzag flashes, revealed behind it variously shaped masses of flame. These last were like sheet lightning, but much larger. Upon this, our Spanish friend, whom I mentioned above, addressing himself to my mother and me with great energy and urgency, "If your brother," he said, "if your uncle be safe, he certainly wishes you may be so too. But if he perished, it was his desire, no doubt, that you might both survive him. Why, therefore, do you delay your escape a moment?" We could never think of our own safety, we said, while we were uncertain of his. Upon this our friend left us, and withdrew from the danger with the utmost precipitation. Soon afterwards the cloud began to descend and cover the sea. It had already surrounded and concealed the island of Capri and the promontory of Misenum. My mother now besought, urged, even commanded me to make my escape at any rate, which, as I was young, I might easily do. As for herself, she said, her age and corpulency rendered all attempts of that sort impossible. However, she would willingly meet death if she could have the satisfaction of seeing that she was not the occasion of mine. But I absolutely refused to leave her, and taking her by the hand, compelled her to go with me. She complied with great reluctance, and not without many reproaches to herself for retarding my flight. The ashes now began to fall upon us, though in no great quantity. I looked back. A dense, dark mist seemed to be following us, spreading itself over the country like a cloud. "Let us turn out of the high road," I said, "while we can still see, for fear that, should we fall in the road, we should be pressed to death in the dark by the crowds that are following us." We had scarcely sat down when the night came upon us, not such as we have when the sky is cloudy, or when there is no moon, but that of a room when it is shut up, and all the lights put out. You might hear the shrieks of women, the screams of children, and the shouts of men, some calling for their children, others for their parents, others for their husbands, and seeking to recognize each other by the voices that replied, one lamenting his own fate, another that of his family, some wishing to die from the very fear of dying, some lifting their hands to the gods, but the greater part convinced that there were now no gods at all, and that the final endless night of which we have heard had come upon the world. Among these there were some who augmented the real terrors by others imaginary or wilfully invented. I remember some who declared that one part of Misenum had fallen, that another was on fire, which was false, but they found people to believe them. It now grew rather lighter, which we imagined to be rather the forerunner of an approaching burst of flames, as in truth it was, than the return of day. However, the fire fell at a distance from us. Then again we were immersed in thick darkness, and a heavy shower of ashes rained upon us, which we were obliged every now and then to stand up to shake off. Otherwise we should have been crushed and buried in the heap. I might boast that during all this scene of horror not a sigh or expression of fear escaped me, had not my support been grounded in that miserable, though mighty, consolation that all mankind were involved in the same calamity, and that I was perishing with the world itself. At last this dreadful darkness was dissipated by degrees, like a cloud or smoke. The real day returned, and even the sun shone out, though with a lurid light, like when an eclipse is coming on. Every object that presented itself to our eyes, which were extremely weakened, seemed changed, being covered deep with ashes, as if with snow. We returned to Misenum, where we refreshed ourselves as well as we could, and passed an anxious night between hope and fear, though indeed with a much larger share of the latter, for the earthquake still continued, while many frenzied persons ran up and down, heightening their own and their friends' calamities by terrible predictions. However, my mother and I, notwithstanding the danger we had passed, and that which still threatened us, had no thoughts of leaving the place till we could receive some news of my uncle. And now you will read this narrative without any view of inserting it in your history. of which it is not in the least worthy, and indeed you must put it down to your own request, if it should appear not worth even the trouble of a letter. Farewell. End of Pliny the Younger's description of the eruption of Vesuvius. Read by Thomas Copeland.
How Burroughs Wrote the Tarzan Tales by Robert H. Davis. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Ben Tucker. How Burroughs Wrote the Tarzan Tales by Robert H. Davis. In all the history of popular American fiction, nothing is more absorbing than a chronological record of the Tarzan Tales, the first of which, Tarzan of the Apes, appeared in the pages of the Argosy All-Story in 1912. In spite of the fact that the serial made a tremendous impression, nearly every reputable book publisher in the United States rejected it, including McClurg, who afterwards secured and published it in book form. 13 London publishers declined it with thanks until Methuen came to the rescue and carried the banner of Tarzan to every English-speaking corner of the world. The summer of the adventures of Tarzan is interesting. In Tarzan of the Apes, the first volume, an English couple, Lord and Lady Greystoke, were put ashore on the west coast of Africa by a mutinous crew. The man built a cabin where the couple were safe from the attacks of wild beasts, but one day he was set upon by a huge gorilla. Lady Greystoke came to his rescue, and though she shot the beast, the shock of the encounter unbalanced her mind. That night a son was born to her, and a year later she died. Upon the same day her husband was killed by giant apes, one of which, a female called Kala, having just lost her own son, adopted the infant Greystoke. She called the man-child Tarzan, which means white skin, in the language of the great apes, and reared him to maturity, a savage beast among savage beasts. The life of Tarzan of the Apes is symbolic of the evolution of man and the rise of civilization, during which mankind gained much in its never-ending search for luxury, but not without the sacrifice of many desirable characteristics, as well as the greater part of its liberty. How Tarzan grew almost to manhood before he saw another human, how he fought the battles of the primitive jungle after the manner of the beasts of the jungle, how he rose to the kingship of them all, developing an amazing strength and a courage supreme above the very beast of the jungle itself. Upon these things are built the action of the story. And at last came white men, and a white girl, Jane Porter. Most of the former he looked upon as weaklings and held in contempt, but the latter he loved and won, and lost. Here ended the first book of Tarzan. The second, entitled The Return of Tarzan, was written in Chicago in 1913, and therein Tarzan, disgusted with civilization, returns to his beloved jungles, where once again he takes his place among the apes of the tribe of Kerchak, roams the jungle with Tantor the elephant, and wages anew his battles with Numa the lion and Sheeta the panther. He hunts Horta the boar and Hara the deer, becomes chief of the warlike tribe of Waziri, discovers the lost city of Opar, and unseals its buried treasure vaults. Through the pages of The Return of Tarzan, the ape-man is pursued by Nicholas Rokoff and Alexis Pulvich, 2 Russians whose evil machinations he had once foiled. But in the end he finds Jane Porter again, and this time he doesn't lose her. By this time the public had begun to clamor for the Tarzan books, and Burroughs turned his attention seriously to the consideration of a market that was extending throughout the English-speaking world. The third book was The Beasts of Tarzan, written in 1914 at San Diego. Tarzan's infant son is stolen by Pulvich and Rokoff, as is also Lady Greystoke II. In search for them, Tarzan is lured to the deck of the ship upon which they are being held, and is himself made prisoner. He is marooned upon an uninhabited island off the west coast of Africa, while his wife and baby are taken to the mainland, where they escape with the aid of a ship's cook. Tarzan meets Akut, the bull ape, and befriends Sheeta the panther. With these two, a black warrior and several of Akut's apes, he forms a savage company which crosses to the mainland in a war canoe. The search into the interior for Jane and the baby is accompanied by numerous savage battles between the beasts of Tarzan and the enemies who would thwart them. Paulvitch escapes, but hist, we shall meet them again. The Son of Tarzan, fourth of the series, was written in Oak Park, Illinois in 1915. The diabolical Paulvitch, who was showing Akut as a trained ape in London, lures the son of Tarzan away. The ape kills Paulvitch, the movie version to the contrary notwithstanding, and young Tarzan and Akut depart for Africa. In this story, Mr. Burroughs introduces a boy and girl who lead a wild and free life in the jungle more or less in Burroughs' best manner, and introduces additional characters devised more or less for the purpose of continuing the activities of Tarzan and his friends for an indefinite period. These characters have a rather rough time of it, but things shape up fairly well toward the end, and all beasts, including Tantor and Bolgani, and Dango, Bara, Horta, Shita, Hista the snake, and also Goob the baboon, contribute drama to the great symposium. Tarzan and the Jewels of Opar, written in Oak Park, 1915, makes the fifth volume. The ape-man goes back after some more of the forgotten ingots in the treasure vaults of the ancient city, and discovers a room full of jewels after being injured during an earthquake and losing his memory. A Belgian murderer and an Arab raider join forces to abduct Lady Greystoke and ruin Tarzan. Basuli is there, and Mugambi, with other old friends of the family. Kadi, the high priest of Opar, probably the coarsest hidden city diplomat that has ever reigned, because of his jealousy of Tarzan, spills all the beans that one man can spill in one volume. Tarzan triumphs. At this juncture in Law's career, Mr. Burroughs decided to supply the increasing demand with a series of short stories under the title The Jungle Tales of Tarzan. He released 8 short stories from Oak Park, Illinois and Los Angeles, California, in 1916 and 1917. These stories dealt with the period in the life of Tarzan before he knew aught of white men or civilization. The preparation of these stories taxed his ingenuity and caused him as much effort as 3 novels, but the popularity of Tarzan survived. Tarzan the Untamed, the 7th book written in Oak Park in Los Angeles in 1918 and 1919, was a contribution to the history of the late-lamented World War, and explained how Tarzan won German East Africa from the enemy, drafting at will the assistance of the British Army, which, hooked up with Tarzan's own amazing muscular gifts, enabled him to win from start to finish. The 7th volume is the only Tarzan book that has not been reprinted in the German language. Tarzan the Terrible, the 8th volume, came to light in 1920 at Tarzana Ranch, Reseda, California, Mr. Burroughs' present home. A year or so before the late Walter Winans, Esquire of London, began to send Burroughs clippings relative to purported encounters between white and native hunters and some huge creatures of prehistoric appearance in the swamps of Central Africa, Mr. Winans gave guarantees in the belief of the existence of such a creature. Predicated upon this belief, Burroughs constructed the Griff of Tarzan the Terrible, and wove the story of the Hodan and the Wazdan and the land of Paul Uidan. The author regards these as his most fascinating experiment in the enterprise of creating monsters. He always felt that he would have had his money's worth in entertainment had the book been a flat failure. On the contrary, it was a tremendous success. And now again Tarzan emerges from his jungle vastness in the 9th story, the opening chapters of which appear in this current number of the Argosy All-Story Weekly under the title Tarzan and the Golden Lion. The author takes the reader into another world in Central Africa that only Tarzan could have found and conquered. The villains come all the way from London to rob the treasure vaults of Opar, and they arrive at about the same time that Tarzan comes after another supply to fill his war chest. The Golden Lion came to him as a cub and was curbed to the master's will. Together the King of Beasts and the King of the Jungle wage war against their enemies, conquer the holy city of the Flaming God, steal the ruling power from La, and defeat the race of gorilla men who inhabit the Valley of Diamonds. In this story you will have Edgar Rice Burroughs at his best and Tarzan at his bravest. It is interesting to know that the Tarzan tales have been translated into Swedish, Norwegian, Danish, Dutch, German, Russian, and Arabic. Offers have been made for the French, Spanish, and Italian translation rights, which the author is not yet prepared to negotiate. Truly the history of Tarzan, as created by Edgar Rice Burroughs, is in itself a wonder story of magic and imagination. End of How the Burroughs Wrote the Tarzan Tales by Robert H. Davis.
The Kitten, from Thoreau's Journal, February 15, 1861. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. February 15, 1861. A kitten is so flexible that she is almost double. The hind parts are equivalent to another kitten, with which the forepart plays. She does not discover that her tail belongs to her till you tread upon it. How eloquent she can be with her tail! She jumps into a chair, and then stands on her hind legs to look out the window. Looks steadily at objects far and near, first gazing this side, then that, for she loves to look out a window as much as any gossip. Ever and anon she bends back her ears to hear what is going on within the room, and all the while her eloquent tail is reporting the progress and success of her survey by speaking gestures. Then what a delicate hint she can give with her tail, passing perhaps underneath as you sit at table, and letting the tip of her tail just touch your legs, as much as to say, I am here and ready for that milk or meat, though she may not be so forward as to look round at you when she emerges. Only skin deep lies the feral nature of the cat unchanged still. I just had the misfortune to walk onto our cat's legs as she was lying playfully spread out under my chair. Imagine the sound that arose, and which was excusable, but what will you say to the fierce growls and flashing eyes with which she met me for a quarter of an hour thereafter? No tiger in its jungle could have been savager. End of The Kitten, from Thoreau's Journal, February 15th, 1861. Read for LibriVox by Sue Anderson.
Rose Psyche. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Availle in March 2026. Rose Psyche, from Scientific American Supplement No. 1178, June 25, 1898. Rose Psyche. The hybrid Polyantha rose Psyche is a seedling from the dwarf Polyantha rose Golden Fairy, crossed with the pollen of the Crimson Rambler. Its growth and habit, though more delicate, much resembles the Rambler. It is apparently quite hardy, and is very free flowering, but we fear not perpetual. The flowers are produced in clusters of from 15 to 25, and are 2 to 2½ inches across when fully expanded. In the bud stage they are very pretty and well formed. The color is white, suffused with salmon rose and pink, with a yellow base to the petals. It is a real companion to Crimson Rambler. The Gardener's Chronicle. End of Rose Psyche.
A Note on the Relative Value of Punishment and Reward as Motives by Mildred Hodge and Ruth Stocking. Recorded by Leon Harvey for LibriVox.org. A Note on the Relative Value of Punishment and Reward as Motives by Mildred A. Hodge and Ruth J. Stocking from the Psychological Laboratory of the Johns Hopkins University. 2 figures. In his book on the dancing mouse, Yerkes says The desire for food is unsatisfactory as a motive in animal behavior work. First, because a condition of utter hunger is unfavorable for the performance of complex acts. Second, because it is impossible to control the strength of the motive. And finally, because it is an inhumane method of experimentation. In general, the method of punishment is more satisfactory than the method of reward, because it can be controlled to a greater extent. Since a large number of experiments in animal behavior have been made with the use of either punishment alone or with food alone as a motive, it seemed desirable to compare under uniform experimental conditions the relative efficiency of the two methods of training. The tests described below were made on albino and black and white rats. All the rats were given the same problem, namely, to discriminate between two lights of different intensity. Some of the animals were punished for incorrect choices and others rewarded for correct choices. The punishment was a light electric shock, the reward, milk-soaked bread. The rapidity of learning in the two cases was taken as an indication of the value of the method. It seemed desirable to test with still other animals the value of a combination of the two methods, punishment and reward. The apparatus consisted of a discrimination box, see Figure 1, similar to the well-known box of Yerkes. The rat to be tested was placed in A, and the door, I, leading to compartment B, was opened by the experimenter. After the animal had entered B, the door was closed. The only way in which the animal could return to A was by passing through the compartments W or W with an apostrophe. Thence through the corresponding doors V or V apostrophe, and into the alleys which open into A or O and O apostrophe. The door between the alley and compartment A was opened for the animal the moment it sought to enter A. The floors of W and W apostrophe were wired to form a punishment grill, the two poles of which were connected with a porter inductorium. A convenient switch enabled the operator to cause the current to flow either through W or W apostrophe. Two Columbia drive cells, number 6, finished the primary circuit. The position of the secondary coil was fixed at 7 centimeters. The stimulus lights consisted of two uncalibrated carbon lamps, 115 DC of 2 and 6 CP, respectively, placed in the light compartments C and C apostrophe. The partitions separating B and C contained two standard stimulus plates, S and S apostrophe, 5.5 centimeters in diameter, placed 25 centimeters between centers. The distance between the center of the plate and the floor of the box was 10 centimeters. Both plates were covered with flashed glass, as recommended in the report of Yerkes and Watson. Figure 1 is displayed on the previous page. Discrimination box after Professor Yerkes. The test was made upon light-adapted animals in a room, the general illumination of which barely sufficed to show the movements of the animals. 6 female rats were used in the experiment. 5 of them, numbers 1, 3, 5, 7, and 9, were hybrid, and all from the same litter. Numbers 1 and 5 were albinos. 3, 7, and 9 were black and white rats with pigmented eyes. Number 11 was a pure white rat from another litter. Preliminary experiments were begun upon the rats when they were 49 days old. All the rats were allowed to explore the experiment box for 2 days before preference tests were begun. In conducting the preference tests, 10 trials a day were given each rat. The experimental conditions of the preference tests were made the same for all the animals. At every trial, food was placed in a small dish in each of the alleys V and V apostrophe. The lights were interchanged frequently and at irregular intervals in order to exclude choice by position. The two lights occupied the two positions left and right an equal number of times. The two lights are designated. The one is B, brighter, 16 CP. The other is D, darker, 2 CP. Table 1 shows a record of choices made by the animals. From this table it will be seen that 2 rats had no preference, that one had a slight preference for the darker compartment, whereas 3 showed a preference for the brighter of the 2. In accordance with the generally accepted method of training against the preference, those rats which had been found in the preliminary tests to choose the brighter of the compartments were made in the discrimination test to choose the darker, and vice versa. In forming 2 of the groups, the rats which showed no preference were grouped with those which had shown a preference. 3 groups of 2 individuals each were formed. Each group of 2 contained 1 albino and 1 black and white rat with pigmented eyes. The following table shows the composition of the groups. Table 1 is displayed on the page. An additional table is displayed on the page. Group 1, punished after choosing D and rewarded after choosing B, contained rat, 1 albino, no preference. 5 pigmented eyes, preference for D. Group 2, punished after choosing B, contained rat, 3 albino, no preference. 7 pigmented eyes, preference for B. Group 3, rewarded after choosing D, contained rat, 9 pigmented eyes, preference for B. 11 albino, preference for B. Group 2 was never rewarded. However, since the rats in this group showed great hesitation in entering B after having been punished a few times, they were occasionally fed in A, sometimes after a correct choice and sometimes after an incorrect choice. Results. Table 2 shows the records made by the 6 rats. Each determination represents the percentage of error for a series of 10 trials. 10 trials a day were usually given. If, however, a rat made 10 correct choices during one day, he was given 5 more trials. Table 2 is displayed on the page, percentages of error for daily series of 10 trials each. When a perfect record for 2 days, i.e. 30 consecutive correct choices, has been made, the problem was regarded as learned. The table and curves show that the rats varied considerably in their daily record, as well as in the time required to learn the problem completely. Rat 1, albino group 1, punished and rewarded, completed the association in 490 trials. Rat 5, pigmented eyes of the same group, in 550 trials. Rat 3, albino group 2, punished, learned the problem in 550 trials, but Rat 7, pigmented eyes, group 2, had not learned the problem in 620 trials, at which time the work had to be discontinued. Neither of the rats in Group 3, rewarded, learned the problem in 590 trials, at which time work had to be discontinued with them also. The table shows also that the rats exhibited great instability even until the end of the experiment. A comparison of the errors of rats 3 and 7 shows that Rat 3 had never made a wholly perfect series of records before her 520th trial, whereas Rat 7 had made several perfect daily records before the 30 errorless choices were made in succession. Figure 2 shows the error curves for the 3 groups. The ordinates represent the percentage of error, the abscissa the number of groups of 10 trials each. It will be seen from these curves that Group 1, which was both punished and rewarded, was the only group in which both rats made the discrimination. The curve of the punished group approaches that of Group 1 more nearly than does the curve of the rewarded group, since one individual of the punished group learned the problem. Several interesting observations were made during the work. The rats of the several groups maintained different attitudes toward the work. Those animals which received the electric shock showed after a few trials great hesitation before entering B, whereas the rats of Group 3, which we never shocked, rushed into B without making any apparent choice. The rats which were punished became unwilling after a time to enter the electric box, and they assiduously avoided the door to this compartment, apparently associating the light with the shock. Great patience was often required of the experimenters, as several minutes would sometimes elapse before the rat could be persuaded to come to the door 1. When at length it passed its head through the door, it would look to right and left several times before making a choice. This indecision would as often precede an incorrect choice as a correct one. However, as the discrimination became established, the animal ceased to fear to enter the electric compartment. It would come to the door. I glanced only once to left and right, and then dart towards the correct light. Although the rats which received punishment were at first unwilling to enter the electric compartment, they never became sulky, as did the turtles used by Castile. The rats remained in good condition throughout the experiment, except for the nervousness referred to above. None of the animals experienced any ill effect from the work, and no difference in the general health and activity of the 3 groups were observed. Figure 2 is displayed on the page. Error curves plotted from the data given in Table 2. The numerals in the left margin indicate the percentage of error, those below the baseline of the number of the series, each series consisting of 10 consecutive trials. The solid line is the error curve of Group 1, rewarded and punished. The dotted line is the error curve of Group 2, punished. The dashed line is the error curve of Group 3, rewarded. The failure of the rewarded rats to learn the problem in the time allowed of this particular interest, since their preliminary work, preference tests, was along the same line as the work of the problem, whereas in the case of the rats which were punished, a new element, the electric shock, was introduced. The difference in the rate of visual discrimination between albinos and rats with pigmented eyes deserves notice. In each group, the white rat made the discrimination before the rat with pigmented eyes. This is apparently not in harmony with the results obtained by Carl Waugh, who states that the discrimination of the albino mouse is not so good as that of the mouse with pigmented eyes. In neither the work of Dr. Waugh nor in the present work were a sufficient number of animals used to settle the question of the relative discriminative ability of the two varieties. It seems evident from this experiment that a combination of punishment and reward motives is more effective in bringing about visual discrimination in the rat than is either punishment or reward used alone. It seems evident also that punishment is more effective than reward, at least in so far as the rate of learning is concerned. End of A Note on the Relative Value of Punishment and Reward as Motives by Mildred A. Hodge and Ruth J. Stocking. Recorded by Leon Harvey for LibriVox.org.
Prejudices, 5th Series by H.L. Mencken. Chapter 5, Beethoven. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 5, Beethoven. Beethoven was one of those lucky men whose stature, viewed in retrospect, grows steadily. How many movements have there been to put him on the shelf? At least a dozen in the 100 years since his death. There was one only a few years ago in New York, launched by idiot critics and supported by the war fever. His place, it appeared, was to be taken by such prophets of the new Enlightenment as Stravinsky. The net result of that movement was simply that the best orchestra in America went to pot, and Beethoven survived unscathed. It is indeed almost impossible to imagine displacing him, at all events in the concert hall where the challenge of Bach cannot reach him. Surely the 19th century was not deficient in master musicians. It produced Schubert, Schumann, Chopin, Wagner, and Brahms, to say nothing of a whole horde of Dvorak's, Tchaikovsky's, Debussy's, Raff's, Verdi's, and Puccini's. Yet it gave us nothing better than the first movement of the Eroica. That movement, the first challenge of the new music, remains its last word. It is the noblest piece of absolute music ever written in the sonata form, and it is the noblest piece of program music. In Beethoven, indeed, the distinction between the two became purely imaginary. Everything he wrote was, in a way, program music, including even the first two symphonies, and everything was absolute music, including even the battle grotesquerie. Is the latter indeed as bad as ancient report makes it? Why doesn't some Kapellmeister let us hear it? It was a bizarre jest of the gods to pit Beethoven, in his first days in Vienna, against Papa Haydn. Haydn was undeniably a genius of the first water, and after Mozart's death had no apparent reason to fear a rival. If he did not actually create the symphony as we know it today, then he at least enriched the form with its first genuine masterpieces, and not with a scant few, but literally with dozens. Tunes of the utmost loveliness gushed from him like oil from a well. More, he knew how to manage them. He was a master of musical architectonics. If his music is sniffed at today, then it is only by fools. There are at least 6 of his symphonies that are each worth all the cacophony hatched by a whole herd of Schoenbergs and Eric Satie's, with a couple of corngolds thrown in to flavor the pot. But when Beethoven stepped in, then poor old Papa had to step down. It was like pitting a gazelle against an aurochs. One colossal bellow, and the combat was over. Musicians are apt to look at it as a mere contest of technicians. They point to the vastly greater skill and ingenuity of Beethoven, his firmer grip upon his materials, his greater daring and resourcefulness, his far better understanding of dynamics, rhythms, and clang tints. In brief, his tremendously superior musicianship. But that was not what made him so much greater than Haydn, for Haydn, too, had his superiorities. For example, his far readier inventiveness, his capacity for making better tunes. What lifted Beethoven above the old master, and above all other men of music, save perhaps Bach and Brahms, was simply his greater dignity as a man. The feelings that Haydn put into tone were the feelings of a country pastor, a rather civilized stockbroker, a viola player gently mellowed by Kulmbacher. When he wept, it was with the tears of a woman who has discovered another wrinkle. When he rejoiced, it was with the joy of a child on Christmas morning. But the feelings that Beethoven put into his music were the feelings of a god. There was something Olympian in his snarls and rages, and there was a touch of hellfire in his mirth. It is almost a literal fact that there is not a trace of cheapness in the whole body of his music. He is never sweet and romantic. He never sheds conventional tears. He never strikes orthodox attitudes. In his lightest moods, there is the immense and inescapable dignity of the ancient Hebrew prophets. He concerns himself not with the puerile agonies of love, but with the eternal tragedy of man. He is a great tragic poet, and like all great tragic poets, he is obsessed by a sense of the inscrutable meaninglessness of life. From the Eroica onward, he seldom departs from that theme. It roars through the first movement of the C minor, and it comes to a stupendous final statement in the ninth. All this, in his day, was new in music, and so it caused murmurs of surprise and even indignation. The step from Mozart's Jupiter to the first movement of the Eroica was uncomfortable. The Viennese began to wriggle in their stalls, but there was one among them who didn't wriggle, and that was Franz Schubert. Turn to the first movement of his Unfinished, or to the slow movement of his Tragic, and you will see how quickly the example of Beethoven was followed, and with what genius. But there was a long hiatus after that, with Mendelssohn, Weber, Chopin, and company performing upon their pretty pipes. Eventually the day of November 6, 1876, dawned in Karlsruhe, and with it came the first performance of Brahms's C minor. Once more the gods walked in the concert hall. They will walk again when another Brahms is born, but not before, for nothing can come out of an artist that is not in the man. What ails the music of all the Tchaikovskys, Stravinskys, and Strausses? What ails it is that it is the music of shallow men. It is often, in its way, lovely. It bristles with charming musical ideas. It is infinitely ingenious and workmanlike, but it is as hollow at bottom as a bull by Bishop Manning. It is the music of second-rate men. Beethoven disdained all their artifices. He didn't need them. It would be hard to think of a composer, even of the fourth rate, who worked with thematic material of less intrinsic merit. He borrowed tunes wherever he found them. He made them up out of snatches of country jigs. When he lacked one altogether, he contented himself with a simple phrase, a few banal notes. All such things he viewed simply as raw materials. His interest was concentrated upon their use. To that use of them he brought the appalling powers of his unrivaled genius. His ingenuity began where that of other men left off. His most complicated structures retained the overwhelming clarity of the Parthenon, and into them he got a kind of feeling that even the Greeks could seldom match. He was preeminently a modern man, with all traces of the barbarian vanished. In his gorgeous music there went all of the high skepticism that was of the essence of the 18th century, but into it there also went the new enthusiasm, the new determination to challenge and beat the gods that dawned with the 19th. The older I grow, the more I am convinced that the most portentous phenomenon in the whole history of music was the first public performance of the Eroica on April 7, 1805. The manufacturers of program notes have swathed that gigantic work in so many layers of childish legend and speculation that its intrinsic merits have been almost forgotten. Was it dedicated to Napoleon I? If so, was the dedication sincere or ironical? Who cares? That is, who with ears? It might have been dedicated just as well to Louis XIV, Paracelsus, or Pontius Pilate. What makes it worth discussing, today and forever, is the fact that on its very first page, Beethoven threw his hat into the ring and laid his claim to immortality. Bang, and he is off. No compromise, no easy bridge from the past. The Second Symphony is already miles behind. A new order of music has been born. The very manner of it is full of challenge. There is no sneaking into the foul business by way of a mellifluous and disarming introduction, no preparatory hemming and hawing to cajole the audience and enable the conductor to find his place in the score. Nay, out of silence comes the angry crash of the tonic triad, and then at once, with no pause, the first statement of the first subject, grim, domineering, harsh, raucous, and yet curiously lovely, with its astounding collision with that electrical C-sharp. The carnage has begun early. We are only in the 7th measure. In the 13th and 14th comes the incomparable roll down the simple scale of E-flat, and what follows is all that has ever been said, perhaps all that ever will be said about music making in the grand manner. What was afterward done, even by Beethoven, was done in the light of that perfect example. Every line of modern music that is honestly music bears some sort of relation to that epic-making first movement. The rest is Beethovenish, but not quintessence. There is a legend that the funeral march was put in simply because it was a time of wholesale butchery, and funeral marches were in fashion. No doubt the first-night audience in Vienna, shocked and addled by the piled-up defiances of the first movement, found the lugubrious strains grateful. But the scherzo? Another felonious assault upon poor Papa Haydn. Two giants boxing clumsily to a crazy piping by an orchestra of dwarfs. No wonder some honest Viennese in the gallery yelled, "I'd give another kreutzer if the thing would stop." Well, it stopped finally, and then came something reassuring, a theme with variations. Everyone in Vienna knew and esteemed Beethoven's themes with variations. He was, in fact, the rising master of themes with variations in the town. But a joker remained in the pack. The variations grew more and more complex and surprising. Strange novelties got into them. The polite exercises became tempestuous, moody, cacophonous, tragic. At the end, a harsh, hammering, exigent row of chords, the C minor symphony casting its sinister shadow before. It must have been a great night in Vienna, but perhaps not for the actual Viennese. They went to hear a new grand symphony in D sharp. What they found in the Theater an der Wien was a revolution. End of Prejudices, 5th series, Chapter 5, Beethoven, by H.L. Mencken.
Shoal of Porpoises, from the Naval Chronicle, Volume 34, 1815. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Early in the morning of September 7th, a large shoal of the cetaceous tribe was seen passing campus upon the Forth. The villagers, headed by the fishermen, went immediately in pursuit, in boats and on the bank, and on overtaking them near Polmaze, where they were joined by a reinforcement of adventurers, began the work of death with boat-hooks, net-forks, pitchforks, spits and muskets. The latter instruments, however, being found more dangerous to the assailants than the assailed, they confined themselves to their rude and murderous harpoons. To wield these with greater effect, they endeavoured to chase the fish to the edge of the water, where, if they did not dispatch them, found time to lash a boat to their fins, and in this hazardous manner continued to inflict wounds till the victim expired, which in 1 or 2 cases was not till he had dragged his persecutors up and down several miles. One of the largest drove in the stern of a boat with one stroke of its tail, and split and sunk it with another. The route proceeded up the river as far as Cambeth Kenneth Abbey, where another body of the assailants joined in the fray. Out of 60, of which the shoal consisted, 50 were secured. The rest escaped backwards. A day or two after, about twice this number were killed near Alloa, and lower down the river numberless shoals were seen. They turned out to be common porpoises, distinguished from the grampus by a deep snout, longer and more tapered pectoral fins. They were of very different dimensions, from 8 or 10 to 20 feet long. The blubber of the latter were about 2 inches thick, and was purchased by soap manufacturers at an average of about 30 shillings per fish. The bodies were sunk on the day in which they were killed, but floated the next, when putrid fermentation began. They evidently came on a predatory excursion, for salmon was seen leaping out of the river, or swimming in terror to the shore, and the little smelts were sometimes returned alive from their jaws when speared by their pursuers. End of Shoal of Porpoises, from the Naval Chronicle, read by Alister.
Wild Apples by Henry David Thoreau. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The History of the Apple Tree. It is remarkable how closely the history of the apple tree is connected with that of man. The geologist tells us that the order of the Rosaceae, which includes the apple, also the true grasses, and the Labiatae, or mints, were introduced only a short time previous to the appearance of man on the globe. It appears that apples made a part of the food of that unknown primitive people whose traces have lately been found at the bottom of the Swiss lakes, supposed to be older than the foundation of Rome, so old that they had no metallic implements. An entire black and shriveled crabapple has been recovered from their stores. Tacitus says of the ancient Germans that they satisfied their hunger with wild apples, among other things. Niebuhr observes that the words for a house, a field, a plough, ploughing, wine, oil, milk, sheep, apples, and others relating to agriculture and the gentler ways of life, agree in Latin and Greek, while the Latin words for all objects pertaining to war or the chase are utterly alien from the Greek. Thus, the apple tree may be considered a symbol of peace, no less than the olive. The apple was early so important and so generally distributed that its name traced to its root in many languages signifies fruit in general. Melon in Greek means an apple, also the fruit of other trees, also a sheep and any cattle, and finally riches in general. The apple tree has been celebrated by the Hebrews, Greeks, Romans, and Scandinavians. Some have thought that the first human pair were tempted by its fruit. Goddesses are fabled to have contended for it, dragons were set to watch it, and heroes were employed to pluck it. The tree is mentioned in at least 3 places in the Old Testament, and its fruit in 2 or 3 more. Solomon sings, "As the apple tree among the trees of the wood, so is my beloved among the sons." And again, "Stay me with flagons, comfort me with apples." The noblest part of man's noblest feature is named from this fruit, the apple of the eye. The apple tree is also mentioned by Homer and Herodotus. Ulysses saw in the glorious garden of Alcinous pears and pomegranates and apple trees bearing beautiful fruit. And according to Homer, apples were among the fruits which Tantalus could not pluck, the wind ever blowing their boughs away from him. Theophrastus knew and described the apple tree as a botanist. According to the Prose Edda, Iduna keeps in a box the apples which the gods, when they feel old age approaching, have only to taste of to become young again. It is in this manner that they will be kept in renovated youth until Ragnarok, or the destruction of the gods. I learned from Loden that the ancient Welsh bards were rewarded for excelling in song by the token of the apple spray, and, in the Highlands of Scotland, the apple tree is the badge of the clan Lamont. The apple tree belongs chiefly to the northern temperate zone. Loden says that it grows spontaneously in every part of Europe except the frigid zone, and throughout Western Asia, China, and Japan. We have also 2 or 3 varieties of the apple indigenous in North America. The cultivated apple tree was first introduced into this country by the earliest settlers, and is thought to do as well or better here than anywhere else. Probably some of the varieties which are now cultivated were first introduced into Britain by the Romans. Pliny, adopting the distinction of Theophrastus, says, "Of trees there are some which are altogether wild, some more civilized." Theophrastus includes the apple among the last, and, indeed, it is in this sense the most civilized of all trees. It is as harmless as a dove, as beautiful as a rose, and as valuable as flocks and herds. It has been longer cultivated than any other, and so is more humanized. And who knows but, like the dog, it will at length be no longer traceable to its wild original. It migrates with man, like the dog and horse and cow, first, perchance, from Greece to Italy, thence to England, thence to America, and our western emigrant is still marching steadily toward the setting sun with the seeds of the apple in his pocket, or perhaps a few young trees strapped to his load. At least 1 million apple trees are thus set farther westward this year than any cultivated ones grew last year. Consider how the blossom week, like the Sabbath, is thus annually spreading over the prairies, for when man migrates he carries with him not only his birds, quadrupeds, insects, vegetables, and his very sword, but his orchard also. The leaves and tender twigs are an agreeable food to many domestic animals, such as the cow, horse, sheep, and goat, and the fruit is sought after by the first, as well as by the hog. Thus there appears to have existed a natural alliance between these animals and this tree from the first. The fruit of the crab in the forests of France is said to be a great resource for the wild boar. Not only the Indian, but many indigenous insects, birds, and quadrupeds welcomed the apple tree to these shores. The tent caterpillar saddled her eggs on the very first twig that was formed, and it has since shared her affections with the wild cherry. And the cankerworm also, in a measure, abandoned the elm to feed on it. As it grew apace, the bluebird, robin, cherrybird, kingbird, and many more, came with haste, and built their nests and warbled in its boughs, and so became orchard birds, and multiplied more than ever. It was an era in the history of their race. The downy woodpecker found such a savory morsel under its bark that he perforated it in a ring quite round the tree before he left it, a thing which he had never done before, to my knowledge. It did not take the partridge long to find out how sweet its buds were, and every winter eve she flew, and still flies, from the wood to pluck them, much to the farmer's sorrow. The rabbit, too, was not slow to learn the taste of its twigs and bark, and when the fruit was ripe, the squirrel half rolled, half carried it to his hole. And even the musquash crept up the bank from the brook at evening, and greedily devoured it, until he had worn a path in the grass there, and when it was frozen and thawed, the crow and the jay were glad to taste it occasionally. The owl crept into the first apple tree that became hollow, and fairly hooted with delight, finding it just the place for him, so, settling down into it, he has remained there ever since. My theme being the wild apple, I will merely glance at some of the seasons in the annual growth of the cultivated apple, and pass on to my special province. The flowers of the apple are perhaps the most beautiful of any tree, so copious and so delicious to both sight and scent. The walker is frequently tempted to turn and linger near some more than usually handsome one, whose blossoms are 2/3 expanded. How superior it is in these respects to the pear, whose blossoms are neither colored nor fragrant. By the middle of July, green apples are so large as to remind us of codling and of the autumn. The sword is commonly strewed with little ones, which fall stillborn, as it were, nature thus thinning them for us. The Roman writer Palladius said, "If apples are inclined to fall before their time, a stone placed in a split root will retain them." Some such notion, still surviving, may account for some of the stones which we see placed to be overgrown in the forks of trees. They have a saying in Suffolk, England, at Michaelmas time, or a little before, half an apple goes to the core. Early apples begin to be ripe about the 1st of August, but I think that none of them are so good to eat as some to smell. One is worth more to scent your handkerchief with than any perfume which they sell in the shops. The fragrance of some fruits is not to be forgotten, along with that of flowers. Some gnarly apple which I pick up in the road reminds me by its fragrance of all the wealth of Pomona, carrying me forward to those days when they will be collected in golden and ruddy heaps in the orchards and about the cider mills. A week or two later, as you are going by orchards or gardens, especially in the evenings, you pass through a little region possessed by the fragrance of ripe apples, and thus enjoy them without price, and without robbing anybody. There is thus about all natural products a certain volatile and ethereal quality which represents their highest value, and which cannot be vulgarized, or bought and sold. No mortal has ever enjoyed the perfect flavor of any fruit, and only the godlike among men begin to taste its ambrosial qualities. For nectar and ambrosia are only those fine flavors of every earthly fruit which our coarse palates fail to perceive, just as we occupy the heaven of the gods without knowing it. When I see a particularly mean man carrying a load of fair and fragrant early apples to market, I seem to see a contest going on between him and his horse on the one side, and the apples on the other, and to my mind the apples always gain it. Pliny says that apples are the heaviest of all things, and that the oxen begin to sweat at the mere sight of a load of them. Our driver begins to lose his load the moment he tries to transport them to where they do not belong, that is, to any but the most beautiful. Though he gets out from time to time and feels of them and thinks they are all there, I see the stream of their evanescent and celestial qualities going to heaven from his cart, while the pulp and skin and core only are going to market. They are not apples, but pumice. Are not these still Iduna's apples, the taste of which keeps the gods forever young? And think you that they will let Loki or Thiassi carry them off to Jotunheim, while they grow wrinkled and gray? No, for Ragnarok, or the destruction of the gods, is not yet. There is another thinning of the fruit, commonly near the end of August or in September, when the ground is strewn with windfalls, and this happens especially when high winds occur after rain. In some orchards you may see fully 3/4 of the whole crop on the ground, lying in a circular form beneath the trees, yet hard and green, or if it is a hillside, rolled far down the hill. However, it is an ill wind that blows nobody any good. All the country over, people are busy picking up the windfalls, and this will make them cheap for early apple pies. In October, the leaves falling, the apples are more distinct on the trees. I saw one year in a neighboring town some trees fuller of fruit than I remember to have ever seen before, small yellow apples hanging over the road. The branches were gracefully drooping with their weight, like a barberry bush, so that the whole tree acquired a new character. Even the topmost branches, instead of standing erect, spread and drooped in all directions, and there were so many poles supporting the lower ones that they looked like pictures of banyan trees. As an old English manuscript says, "The mo appelin the tree beareth, the more she boweth to the folk." Surely the apple is the noblest of fruits. Let the most beautiful or the swiftest have it. That should be the going price of apples. Between the 5th and 20th of October, I see the barrels lie under the trees, and perhaps I talk with one who is selecting some choice barrels to fulfill an order. He turns a specked one over many times before he leaves it out. If I were to tell what is passing in my mind, I should say that every one was specked which he had handled, for he rubs off all the bloom, and those fugacious ethereal qualities leave it. Cool evenings prompt the farmers to make haste, and at length I see only the ladders here and there, left leaning against the trees. It would be well if we accepted these gifts with more joy and gratitude, and did not think it enough simply to put a fresh load of compost about the tree. Some old English customs are suggestive, at least. I find them described chiefly in Brand's Popular Antiquities. It appears that on Christmas Eve the farmers and their men in Devonshire take a large bowl of cider with a toast in it, and carrying it in state to the orchard, they salute the apple trees with much ceremony, in order to make them bear well the next season. This salutation consists in throwing some of the cider about the roots of the tree, placing bits of the toast on the branches, and then, encircling one of the best-bearing trees in the orchard, they drink the following toast 3 several times. Here's to thee, old apple tree, whence thou mayest bud, and whence thou mayest blow, and whence thou mayest bear apples enow. Hats full, caps full, bushel, bushel, sacks full, and my pockets full too. Hurrah! Also, what was called apple howling used to be practiced in various counties of England on New Year's Eve. A troop of boys visited the different orchards, and encircling the apple trees, repeated the following words. Stand fast, root, bear well, top, pray God send us a good howling crop. Every twig, apples big, every bough, apples enow. Then they shout in chorus, one of the boys accompanying them on a cow's horn. During this ceremony they rap the trees with their sticks. This is called wassailing the trees, and is thought by some to be a relic of the heathen sacrifice to Pomona. Herrick sings, Wassail the trees that they may bear you many a plum and many a pear, for more or less fruits they will bring, as you so give them wassailing. Our poets have as yet a better right to sing of cider than of wine, but it behooves them to sing better than English Phillips did, else they will do no credit to their muse. End of Wild Apples by Henry David Thoreau. Read by Brian Gallegos.